My parents made me cook and clean for my sister's lavish promotion party, serving 40 elite guests all weekend. When I finally asked for a little help, my mother laughed in my face and told me I was the only one in the family without a real job. I just smiled, set down the dirty dishes, and walked out the front door. Exactly 1 hour later, my sister called me screaming hysterically over the sound of police sirens sobbing that our mother was on the floor and demanding to know what I had done. My name is Maya. I am 35 years old. Before I continue my story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe if you have ever had to finally set a boundary with a toxic family member who underestimated your worth. The heat in the kitchen of the luxury rental estate was absolutely suffocating. I stood elbow deep in greasy gray suds, aggressively scrubbing the baked-on remnants of macaroni and cheese from a massive industrial roasting pan. The air around me was thick and heavy, saturated with the smell of the collard greens, candied yams, and braised short ribs I had spent the last 2 days cooking entirely from scratch. Outside these swinging kitchen doors, 40 of the most elite members of Atlanta society were clinking crystal champagne flutes and laughing. They were celebrating my younger sister Jasmine and her recent promotion, an event entirely funded by her wealthy and perpetually arrogant husband Preston. I wiped a bead of sweat from my forehead with the back of my wrist, feeling the damp fabric of my oversized t-shirt clinging to my back. I had been on my feet since 5 in the morning. The heavy wooden kitchen door swung open, letting in a brief burst of cool air conditioning and the sound of a jazz quartet playing in the grand foyer. My mother Brenda marched into the sweltering kitchen. She was dressed to the absolute nines, draped in a tailored cream suit, dripping in her signature Mikimoto pearls, and adjusting a wide-brimmed designer church hat that probably cost more than my first car. Without a single word of greeting or a simple thank you for the feast I had prepared, she walked straight over to the sink and dropped another towering stack of dirty porcelain plates directly into the water. The greasy splash hit my shirt. I closed my eyes for a fraction of a second, taking a slow breath to steady my rising blood pressure. "Mom," I said, keeping my voice as level as possible. "There are 40 people out there. I cooked the entire menu, I set up the dining hall, and I have been washing dishes for 2 hours. Can Jasmine or Preston not hire a professional cleanup crew for this? They certainly have the money for it." Brenda stopped adjusting her hat and turned to look at me. Her eyes dragged up and down my flour-stained clothes, her lips twisting into a familiar, condescending smirk. She let out a short, sharp scoff that echoed off the stainless steel appliances. "Wash these before Preston's investors arrive," she ordered, her tone dripping with absolute disdain. "You are the only one here without a real job, Maya. The least you can do is make yourself useful while your sister lives the life you could never secure for yourself." The words hung in the humid air of the kitchen, heavy and suffocating. This was the dynamic we had operated under for my entire adult life. Jasmine was the golden child, the perfect daughter, who married the wealthy white finance executive and lived in a pristine townhouse downtown. I was the scapegoat, the quiet older sister they all assumed was struggling because I did not wear designer labels or brag about my bank account at Sunday dinner. They thought my casual clothes and my refusal to participate in their high society posturing meant I was destitute. They thought my quiet exit from corporate America 5 years ago meant I had failed. I looked down at the murky, grease-filled water in the stainless steel sink. Then I looked back up at my mother's smug, satisfied face. I did not give her a dramatic monologue about how unfairly I was treated. I did not scream or cry or beg for her approval like I might have done in my 20s. I simply opened my hands and let the soapy yellow sponge drop into the water with a dull splash. I reached behind my back and untied the strings of my stained apron. I pulled it over my head and tossed it casually onto the pile of dirty plates she had just brought in. Then I reached over to the paper towel dispenser, pulled off a sheet, and slowly dried my hands. "What do you think you are doing?" Brenda snapped, her voice rising in pitch as she watched me pick up my car keys from the kitchen island. "I am done washing dishes," I said calmly. "You listen to me right now, Maya." Brenda stepped into my path, her finger pointing sharply at my chest. "Preston has very important people arriving in 20 minutes. If you walk out that door and embarrass this family, do not even think about showing your face at Thanksgiving. You will be completely cut off. I looked at the woman who had spent my entire life making me feel like a second-class citizen in my own family. I felt absolutely nothing but a profound sense of liberation. "Enjoy the party, Mom," I replied. I stepped around her, pushed open the heavy wooden doors, and walked straight through the grand living room. I did not sneak out the back service entrance the way they expected me to. I walked right past the bewildered guests, right past Jasmine, who was posing for photos by the ice sculpture, and right past Preston, who was loudly boasting to a group of men in tailored suits. I pushed open the massive mahogany front doors, stepped out into the crisp evening air, and walked toward my unassuming sedan parked at the far end of the driveway. The drive away from the estate felt like waking up from a long, suffocating nightmare. I navigated down the winding suburban roads, the sound of the tires humming against the asphalt bringing me a deep sense of peace. I drove for about 15 minutes until I reached a quiet, scenic overlook. I pulled the car over and put it in park. Reaching into the passenger seat, I grabbed my leather tote bag and pulled out my laptop. It was not a standard computer. It was heavily encrypted holding data that would send shockwaves through the very foundation of my family's fabricated reality. I opened the screen, the cool blue light illuminating the dark interior of my car. I navigated to a secure email client and opened a drafted message that I had been sitting on for 6 entire months. For half a year, I had kept this file hidden out of a misplaced sense of family loyalty. I had thought that maybe, just maybe, if I kept quiet and continued to play my assigned role, they would eventually show me a shred of genuine respect. But my mother's words in that kitchen had finally severed the last fragile thread of obligation I felt toward them. They did not want a daughter. They wanted a servant. I attached the heavily encrypted dossier to the email. The recipient list included 3 different federal investigative agencies and the internal compliance board of Preston's investment firm. I stared at the send button for exactly 3 seconds. Then I pressed the trackpad. The screen confirmed the message was sent. I closed the laptop, put the car in drive, and merged back onto the highway heading toward my actual life. Exactly 1 hour later, as I was pulling into the private underground garage of my downtown high-rise, my phone began to ring. The caller ID flashed Jasmine's name. I let it ring 4 times before I finally pressed accept and held the phone to my ear. I did not even get a chance to say hello. Jasmine was screaming hysterically, her voice completely unrecognizable. Through the phone, I could hear a chaotic symphony of destruction. Glass shattering violently against hardwood floors, people shouting in panic, and the unmistakable piercing wail of approaching police sirens growing louder by the second. "Who did you call?" Jasmine shrieked, her voice breaking into ragged sobs. "Maya. Who did you call? Mom just saw him, and oh my God, she is on the floor. The paramedics are trying to get to her, but the police are blocking the door." "Maya, what did you do?" I sat in the quiet luxury of my car, listening to the complete implosion of the golden child's perfect world, and I smiled. "Could you tell me how you envisioned the interaction between Maya and Detective Rollins in the next segment unfolding?" I gripped the steering wheel and listened to the sheer panic pouring through the phone speaker. Jasmine was shrieking so loudly, her voice distorted into static, completely hysterical over the sound of breaking glass and heavy boots echoing in the background. I did not gasp. I did not rush to comfort her. I simply checked my rearview mirror, waited for a break in oncoming traffic, and swung my sedan into a sharp, deliberate turnaround. The drive back to the estate took exactly 8 minutes, giving me plenty of time to appreciate the absolute silence inside my car. When I reached the heavily gated entrance of the rental property, the security guard had already abandoned his post. He was standing on the curb, staring wide-eyed at the flashing red and blue lights reflecting off the wrought iron gates. I drove straight through. Usually, whenever I was summoned to one of Jasmine and Preston's lavish events, I was ordered to park near the caterers by the hidden service entrance. My mother always insisted my practical 5-year-old car was an eyesore that would embarrass them in front of Preston's high society friends. Not tonight. I steered my car right past the gravel driveway, rolled directly over the pristine, perfectly manicured grass, and parked dead center on the front lawn. I felt the tires sink heavily into the immaculate green turf, leaving deep, muddy tracks right next to the prize-winning rose bushes. I put the car in park, grabbed my purse, and walked to the massive double doors with my head held high. The grand foyer was absolute pandemonium. The hired jazz quartet had abruptly stopped playing, leaving their instruments abandoned on the stage. 40 elite guests, the absolute cream of Atlanta society, and the core of Preston's supposedly exclusive investor circle were huddled in tight, anxious clusters. They were whispering frantically, their eyes darting toward the sunken living room. Women in designer gowns clutched their champagne flutes, completely forgetting their polite society manners as they stretched their necks to watch the spectacle unfold. I pushed my way through the sea of silk and expensive cologne and stepped into the living room. Detective Rollins stood near the massive marble fireplace, flanked by two heavily armed uniformed officers. My mother Brenda was putting on the theatrical performance of a lifetime. She was collapsed dramatically on a velvet armchair, clutching her chest with one hand and fanning herself with a cocktail napkin with the other. She was loudly declaring to no one in particular that her heart simply could not take this kind of targeted harassment. My father, Calvin, was aggressively pacing in front of the police officers, his face flushed dark with rage. He was waving his arms defensively, demanding they release his son-in-law immediately. He shouted about Preston's immaculate reputation, threatening to call the police commissioner, the mayor, and anyone else he thought might care. Jasmine was curled on the sofa, weeping loudly and demanding someone call their private attorney. Preston was backed against the grand piano, sweating profusely through his custom Italian suit. The arrogant, untouchable smirk he had worn all weekend was completely gone. His eyes darted wildly around the room until they landed on me. The moment he saw me standing there, his entire demeanor shifted from a cornered animal to a vicious predator. He lunged forward, throwing a shaking finger directly at my face. "She did this!" Preston screamed, his voice cracking with absolute panic and fury. "She is a jealous, unemployed psycho. She is trying to frame me because I refused to give her a handout. She has been begging us for money for years, and now she is trying to destroy my career because she is a complete and utter failure." The room gasped collectively. The sheer audacity of his lie was staggering, but what happened next was the true betrayal. Without a single second of hesitation, without even asking me what was happening, or demanding proof, my parents turned their crosshairs entirely on me. They immediately backed the wealthy, affluent white son-in-law over their own flesh and blood. Calvin stormed across the Persian rug and stopped inches from my face. He grabbed my upper arm with a grip that bruised, his voice trembling with absolute disgust. "What is wrong with you?" my father hissed, completely ignoring the audience watching our family shatter. "How dare you bring the police into this house? Preston allowed you to be here. He let you cook for his guests so you could feel useful for once in your pathetic life, and this is how you repay his generosity. You march over to that detective right now and tell him you made this whole thing up." Brenda suddenly found the miraculous strength to sit up from her dramatic swoon. She pointed her manicured finger at me from across the room, her voice echoing off the high ceilings. "You have always been jealous of your sister," Brenda yelled, ensuring every society friend in the room heard her. "You could never stand that Jasmine married well while you threw your life away. You are bitter because you have nothing. Retract your lies this instant, Maya. Tell the officers you are mentally unstable. Tell them you made a terrible mistake before you ruin your sister's special night." I looked at the hand gripping my arm. I looked at the parents who had spent 35 years treating me like a burden, parents who were instantly ready to throw me under a criminal investigation just to protect their golden child's husband. For years, I had swallowed my pride to keep the peace. For years, I had accepted their narrative that I was somehow less than them, just an ugly dropout who would never measure up to Jasmine's carefully curated perfection. I remembered all the holidays spent cooking and cleaning while they mingled, all the times my achievements were mocked, and all the moments I was told I simply did not belong in their world. I gently but firmly pried my father's fingers off my arm. I smoothed down the sleeve of my shirt. I did not flinch. I did not cry. I did not raise my voice or offer an emotional defense to people committed to misunderstanding me. I simply looked past my enraged family and locked eyes with Detective Rollins. He gave me a single highly respectful nod, acknowledging the silent authority I actually held in this room. I turned my gaze back to my father, and then slowly shifted my eyes to Preston. The silence in the living room was deafening. Every guest held their breath, waiting for me to break down or apologize. I did not call the police to frame him. I said, my voice cool, steady, and carrying clearly through the silent room. I called them to report stolen property, starting with the $15,000 rental fee for this exact house. Preston's face turned completely ghostly white. "What are you talking about?" My father stepped forward, his voice booming with the practiced authority he used to run his warehouse logistics business. He crossed the Persian rug, placing his body defensively between me and his precious son-in-law. His face was a mask of absolute outrage. "Preston rented this estate for your sister's promotion. He paid for this out of his own pocket to celebrate his wife. You are ruining our family's good name with this nonsense. You walk in here covered in kitchen grease, causing a scene in front of prominent investors, and spout absolute madness to the authorities. Retract whatever lies you told the police right now, Maya." I looked at my father. He stood there, shoulders squared, aggressively defending a white man he had known for 3 years over the daughter he had known for 35. Calvin was so desperate to maintain his proximity to Preston's affluent status that he did not even pause to ask me why the police were standing in his rented foyer. He just immediately assumed I was the problem. I was the broken, jealous liability trying to ruin the golden child's perfect evening. I did not raise my voice. I did not scream or demand his respect. I simply reached into my leather tote bag and pulled out my tablet. I tapped the screen, swiped past my lock screen, and navigated to the settings. I looked up at the massive 85-inch smart television mounted above the marble fireplace. With a single tap, the screen flickered to life. The ambient scenery disappeared, replaced instantly by the mirrored display of my tablet. The sudden shift in lighting drew the eyes of every single person in the room. The 40 elite guests, the whispering socialites, my hyperventilating mother, and my furious father all turned to look at the screen. I let the digital paper trail do the heavy lifting. The first slide I displayed was a sleek professional corporate hierarchy chart for a firm called Apex Financial Technologies. Right at the top of the organizational tree, beside a high-resolution professional headshot of myself, was my name. Maya Caldwell, founder and chief executive officer. Directly beneath my name was the current market valuation of the company, a number with enough zeros to make the entire room collectively inhale. I watched the color drain from my mother's face. Brenda stared at the television screen, her mouth opening and closing silently. Calvin took a slow step backward, his aggressive posture crumbling into absolute bewilderment. "For 5 years you all called me unemployed," I said, my voice carrying clearly across the dead silent room. "When I left my corporate job to build this software firm, you assumed I had failed. You told your church friends I was struggling. You told your country club associates I was finding myself. You let me wash your dishes and serve your guests because you assumed I had nothing else to do. I never corrected you because you never actually asked me about my life. You only ever asked how I compared to Jasmine. And since I refused to buy into your shallow brand-obsessed reality, you decided I was a failure." I swiped my finger across the glass screen. The slide transitioned smoothly. The new display featured the logo of Preston's elite investment management firm. Beside it was a legally binding vendor contract complete with Preston's own digital signature. Preston's firm utilizes my software platform for all of their back-end processing and portfolio management, I explained, looking directly at my brother-in-law. Preston had frozen completely. His eyes were wide, darting from the screen to my face. He never knew he was leasing software from his sister-in-law's company because he never bothered to look at the founder's name on the parent company documents. He was too busy mocking my sedan in the driveway to realize I owned the digital infrastructure, keeping his entire business afloat. As the chief architect of the system, I get automated alerts for severe algorithmic anomalies. I continued pacing slowly toward the center of the room. My software is designed to detect irregularities in fund routing. 6 months ago, a massive red flag triggered on Preston's corporate accounts. I initiated a quiet internal audit to ensure there was not a glitch in my system. There was no glitch. I swiped to the next slide. The screen filled with highlighted bank statements, wire transfers, and offshore routing numbers. The paper trail was undeniable, highlighting millions of dollars siphoned away from the very investors standing in this room. Preston has been actively embezzling client funds for over 2 years. I stated the cold facts hanging in the air. He created dummy accounts to siphon returns before they ever reached the client portfolios. And where did that money go? It went directly into funding the lifestyle you all love to rub in my face. I tapped the screen again, bringing up a detailed, itemized list of expenditures tied directly to the stolen funds. I looked at my sister, whose perfectly contoured face was now streaked with tears of panic. That custom diamond tennis bracelet Preston gave you for your anniversary, Jasmine stolen client money. The down payment on your pristine downtown townhouse, embezzled funds. I turned my gaze to my mother, who was currently gripping the edge of the velvet sofa to keep from collapsing. I pointed to her neck. Those authentic pearls you are wearing right now, Mom. The ones Preston gifted you for Mother's Day to prove he was the best son-in-law in the world. Stolen. Every single lavish vacation, every designer handbag, and the $15,000 rental fee for this exact promotional party. All of it was paid for with money stolen from the people drinking champagne in this living room. The reaction from the crowd was instantaneous and explosive. The investors who had previously been admiring the architecture of the house were now pulling out their cell phones in sheer panic, calling their lawyers and financial advisors. The wealthy socialites began backing away from Brenda as if her pearls were suddenly contagious. The prestige and status my parents worshipped had evaporated in less than 3 minutes, replaced by the horrifying reality of a federal criminal investigation. Detective Rollins stood firmly by the exit, his presence a silent confirmation that everything on that screen was verified fact. Jasmine let out an ear-piercing shriek. She threw her arms around Preston's neck, sobbing wildly. "You are lying," she screamed at me, her voice ragged and desperate. "You forged all of this. You hired someone to make these fake documents because you are jealous. You have always been jealous of me and Preston. Tell them it is a lie, Preston. Tell them she is crazy." Preston violently shoved Jasmine off of him. He was sweating profusely, the pristine collar of his tailored shirt completely soaked. He glared at me with pure, unadulterated hatred. He was cornered, and the sophisticated gentleman act was entirely gone. "You cannot prove any of this," Preston snarled, stepping aggressively in my direction, his fists balled at his sides. "This is an illegal breach of privacy. You tampered with my accounts. I will sue you for defamation. I will tie you up in litigation for the rest of your pathetic life. I will take everything you own." I did not step back. I stood my ground, staring into the eyes of a man whose entire existence was built on theft and unearned arrogance. I offered him a cold, empty smile. "I do not need to prove it to you, Preston," I replied, my voice dangerously calm. "I already proved it to the federal authorities. They have had this entire dossier for 3 hours. Your corporate accounts are already frozen. Your assets are seized. There is nothing left for you to sue me with." Preston's chest heaved as he struggled to breathe, the reality of his total destruction finally setting in. But I was not finished. I turned my attention back to my sister, who was currently hyperventilating on the floor next to the coffee table. "But that is not even the worst part," I said, making sure my voice carried over the murmurs of the panicked crowd. Jasmine, look at line item 4. The massive 85-inch television cast a harsh blue light across the living room. 40 of Atlanta's most elite socialites stood completely frozen. The clinking of crystal champagne flutes had stopped entirely. The only sound left in the grand space was the low hum of the air conditioning and the ragged breathing of my sister. I swiped my finger across the glass surface of my tablet, and the image on the screen zoomed in perfectly on line item 4. I wanted everyone to see it clearly. I wanted the investors to see exactly where their missing capital had gone. I wanted my mother's country club friends to witness the foundation of lies this family had built their status upon. The highlighted row displayed a recurring monthly transfer from a hidden offshore account. Look closely at the routing destination, Jasmine, I said, making sure my voice carried over the deafening silence. It is not going into a mutual fund. It is not going into a diverse portfolio to secure your future. Every single month on the first of the month, exactly $8,000 is wired to a luxury property management group. Jasmine stared at the screen. Her perfectly manicured hands were trembling so violently that her diamond rings caught the light and sent fractured reflections dancing across the walls. She shook her head back and forth, her elaborate updo unraveling slightly. She looked at Preston, her eyes begging him to offer an explanation, begging him to pull a convenient lie out of thin air. "It is a corporate lease," Preston stammered, his voice lacking any of its usual arrogant bass. "It is an executive suite for visiting clients. We use it for out-of-town investors. You do not know what you are talking about, Maya. You are misinterpreting standard corporate expenses." I did not even look at him. I kept my eyes locked directly on my sister. The golden child was finally seeing the tarnish on her perfect life, and I was going to make sure she saw every single ugly detail. "It is the Buckhead Pinnacle Tower, Jasmine," I said calmly. "It is the ultra-exclusive high-rise exactly 3 blocks away from your pristine townhouse. He has not just been stealing from his clients to buy you designer bags and fund these ridiculous promotion parties. He has been stealing to fund his mistress, the one he moved into a penthouse suite so she could be just a 5-minute walk from your marital bed." A collective audible gasp erupted from the 40 guests. It sounded as though all the oxygen had been sucked out of the room at once. The wealthy investors began whispering furiously to one another. The women from my mother's church group lifted their hands to their mouths in absolute shock. The pristine, untouchable reputation of our family was burning to the ground in real time, and there was absolutely nothing anyone could do to stop the fire. Jasmine's knees buckled. She collapsed onto the edge of the velvet sofa, her hands covering her face as she let out a gut-wrenching sob. The golden child facade shattered completely. All her bragging at family dinners, all her condescending remarks about my lack of a husband, all her pride in her wealthy lifestyle evaporated into the humid Georgia air. Her entire existence had been funded by a criminal who was sleeping with another woman 3 blocks away. My mother could not handle the public humiliation. Brenda operated entirely on social currency, and I had just bankrupted her in front of her most important peers. She let out a frantic, high-pitched cry and literally ran across the Persian rug toward the television. She threw her arms out wide, desperately trying to use her body to physically cover the massive glowing screen. It was a pathetic, comical sight. Her expensive cream suit and her oversized designer hat looked absolutely ridiculous as she tried to block the digital evidence of her son-in-law's crimes. "Turn it off!" Brenda screamed, her voice cracking with sheer panic. "Turn this television off right now. Maya, you have ruined everything. You have destroyed your sister. How could you do this to your own family?" My father Calvin immediately tried to salvage whatever scraps of authority he had left. He marched to the center of the room and clapped his hands loudly, trying to project the booming, commanding voice he used to run his warehouse business. "This party is officially over," Calvin bellowed, gesturing toward the front doors. "I must ask all of you to leave our home immediately. This is a private family matter. We are dealing with a severe misunderstanding and a disgruntled family member who is clearly unwell. Please gather your coats and exit the property. We apologize for the disruption." Several of the guests immediately turned toward the foyer, eager to escape the suffocating awkwardness of the situation. They wanted to get to their luxury cars so they could start calling their lawyers and gossiping about the incredible scandal they had just witnessed. But Detective Rollins stepped forward, planting his boots firmly in the center of the room. His voice was calm, authoritative, and carried the undeniable weight of the law. "Nobody is leaving," Detective Rollins announced. The guests froze in their tracks. Calvin spun around, his face dark red with fury. "Excuse me," Calvin demanded, stepping aggressively toward the detective. "I am the patriarch of this family, and I am ordering these people out of my rented home. You have no jurisdiction to keep my guests here over a fabricated spreadsheet on a television screen." Detective Rollins did not even blink. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded document, holding it up for Calvin to see. I have every jurisdiction, sir, the detective replied smoothly. The financial documents displayed on that screen align perfectly with a federal dossier we received over an hour ago. We have already corroborated the offshore routing numbers with the Internal Revenue Service. This is no longer a private family gathering. This house, which was paid for with embezzled funds, is now an active crime scene. Nobody leaves this property until we have taken statements from every single investor in this room. And nobody leaves until your son-in-law is formally processed. The room erupted into total chaos again. The investors began shouting at Preston, demanding to know where their money was. The socialites began arguing with the uniformed officers at the door, complaining that they had nothing to do with the fraud and demanding to go home. Brenda was still standing in front of the television, weeping loudly and praying to God to fix this terrible nightmare. Preston stood completely still amidst the shouting. The sophisticated, wealthy finance executive had entirely disappeared. His tailored suit looked like a costume he had stolen. His carefully styled hair was plastered to his forehead with sweat. He looked around the room, watching the investors he had scammed turn against him. He looked at his wife, who was sobbing uncontrollably on the sofa, refusing to even look at him. He looked at the police officers who were slowly pulling zip ties and handcuffs from their belts. He realized his entire life was over. The offshore accounts were frozen. His career was permanently destroyed. He was going to federal prison, and there was no high-priced lawyer who could save him from the mountain of digital evidence I had just handed to the authorities. In that moment of absolute cornered desperation, Preston lost his mind. His eyes locked onto me, wide and feral. All of his calculated charm melted away into pure, unadulterated rage. He blamed me for his destruction. He blamed me for exposing the rot beneath his perfect life. "You ruined me!" Preston screamed, his voice tearing through the chaos of the living room. "You jealous, pathetic loser!" He dropped his head and lunged across the coffee table. He shoved past a terrified guest, his face contorted into a mask of violent fury. He raised his fist high into the air, putting all of his weight into a desperate attempt to strike me right in the face. My mother screamed. Jasmine shrieked. My father did absolutely nothing to protect his own daughter. I did not move. I did not flinch or raise my arms to block the blow. I stood perfectly still because I knew I did not have to defend myself. Before Preston could even close the distance between us, a towering, impeccably dressed figure stepped smoothly out of the shadows of the grand foyer. A massive hand clad in a custom-tailored suit jacket shot out with lightning speed. The man caught Preston's flying fist in midair, stopping the violent strike with effortless bone-crushing force. The sharp crack of bone against palm echoed like a gunshot over the hysterical crying. Preston did not hit me. Instead, his forward momentum was stopped, entirely suspended in midair by a man who had stepped seamlessly from the shadows of the arched mahogany entryway. The man was a towering figure standing 6'3", radiating an aura of effortless authority that instantly commanded the room. He was dressed in a bespoke midnight blue suit that draped perfectly across his broad shoulders, framing his sharp, fiercely intelligent features. He was an African-American tech magnate whose very presence in a room usually caused Wall Street executives to hold their breath. His large hand was clamped around Preston's wrist like a steel vice. Preston let out a pathetic, high-pitched yelp as the bones in his hand ground together. The wealthy gentleman act he had curated so carefully was now completely replaced by the whimpering of a cornered coward. The stranger did not say a single word to him. He simply twisted Preston's arm sharply behind his back, utilizing Preston's own momentum to spin him around. With one powerful, calculated shove, he launched my brother-in-law directly into the waiting arms of Detective Rollins and the two uniformed police officers. The metallic click of handcuffs snapping shut around Preston's wrists sounded like a final judgment. "You have the right to remain silent." Detective Rollins recited, his voice cutting through the heavy, humid air of the living room as he shoved Preston toward the front door. "I highly suggest you start using it." The 40 elite guests, the absolute pinnacle of Atlanta society, stood frozen like statues in a museum. Nobody dared to breathe. Nobody dared to move. But my mother Brenda was staring at the man who had just saved me. Her eyes were as wide as saucers, her mouth hanging slightly open. For a moment I thought she was going to scream again. But then a horrifying realization washed over her face. She recognized him. Everyone in the upper echelons of the city's financial district recognized him. He was Elijah. He was a self-made billionaire investor, a titan in the technology sector, and the exact man my father Calvin and his now arrested son-in-law had been desperately hunting for the past 3 years. Calvin's warehouse logistics business had been quietly hemorrhaging money for a decade, propped up only by aggressive loans and creative accounting. Calvin and Preston had attended every charity gala, every silent auction, and every exclusive golf tournament, hoping to secure a single 5-minute networking opportunity with Elijah. They had begged for his capital to save Calvin's failing legacy. And now Elijah was standing in their rented living room, adjusting the immaculate cuffs of his suit jacket. Brenda's survival instincts, honed by decades of relentless social climbing, overrode her shock. She completely ignored the fact that her favorite son-in-law was currently being dragged out the front door in handcuffs. She ignored her golden child Jasmine, who was still weeping hysterically on the floor. Brenda smoothed down the front of her tailored cream suit, adjusted her pearls, and forcefully plastered on her most polite, syrupy, high society smile. She stepped forward, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "Mr. Elijah," Brenda cooed, clasping her hands together in a gesture of manufactured grace. "What an absolute honor it is to have you in our home. I am so incredibly sorry you had to witness this unfortunate family dispute. Emotions are just running a little high tonight. Please let me have the catering staff fetch you a glass of our best champagne, and we can move past this ugly misunderstanding." Elijah did not even look at her. It was the most devastating public dismissal I had ever witnessed. Brenda stood there, her hands clasped, offering her brightest smile, and Elijah treated her as if she were completely invisible. He simply turned his back to the woman who had spent my entire life tearing me down and walked directly over to me. He stepped into my personal space, his imposing presence instantly creating a protective shield between me and the hostile room. He raised a gentle hand, brushing a stray lock of hair behind my ear, before wrapping his arms securely around my waist. The warmth and strength of his touch grounded me instantly. "Are you all right, my love?" Elijah asked, his deep, resonant voice filled with genuine concern. It was a stark contrast to the cold indifference he had just shown my mother. "I am perfectly fine," I replied, offering him a soft, genuine smile. I was just finishing up a presentation. The silence that blanketed the living room was absolute. You could hear a pin drop on the thick Persian rug. The 40 guests, the catering staff, and my entire family were paralyzed. They stared at the protective arm wrapped around my waist. They stared at the way this billionaire titan looked at me with absolute adoration and respect. Calvin looked as though he had been struck by lightning. His jaw was slack, his face pale and completely devoid of the aggressive rage he had directed at me just minutes prior. He looked back and forth between Elijah and me, his brain completely failing to compute the scene unfolding in front of him. I turned slightly, keeping Elijah's arm around me, and faced my parents. I looked at the two people who had just demanded I retract my statements and take the fall for a criminal simply because they assumed I was a worthless, unemployed burden. "Mom. Dad," I said, my voice ringing out clear and steady. "You spent my entire life worrying about me dying alone with no prospects. You spent the last 5 years telling your country club friends that I was a tragic failure who could not secure a husband. I would like to officially introduce you to Elijah. He is my fiancé and the co-founder of my software firm." Jasmine let out a choked, devastated gasp from the floor. She stared up at us, her tear-streaked face a picture of total collapse. Her husband, the man who was supposed to guarantee her elite status, was currently sitting in the back of a police cruiser for embezzling millions. And her sister, the family scapegoat she had mocked relentlessly, was standing in the center of the room, engaged to a billionaire tech magnate. The hierarchy she had based her entire self-worth upon had just been obliterated. Calvin staggered backward, hitting the edge of the grand piano. He realized in that agonizing moment that the daughter he had just berated, the daughter he had treated like a servant, was engaged to the very man who held the key to saving his entire logistics empire. The power dynamic had shifted permanently, and Calvin was suddenly standing on the bottom rung. He had spent years praising Preston for his fabricated wealth, while entirely ignoring the daughter who was building a legitimate empire right under his nose. Now the man he desperately needed to save him from financial ruin was standing in his living room, holding the woman he had just publicly humiliated. Brenda, however, refused to accept defeat. The realization that I was engaged to a billionaire overrode her embarrassment. The dollar signs flashed in her eyes, and her deeply ingrained opportunism took the wheel. She looked at Jasmine sobbing on the floor, calculated that her golden child was now married to a felon with frozen bank accounts, and instantly decided to jump ship. She let out a loud theatrical gasp of manufactured joy. "Oh, Maya, darling!" Brenda exclaimed, her voice pitching up an octave as she rushed forward, arms wide open, ready to pull me into a motherly embrace she had denied me for decades. "This is wonderful news. Why did you not tell us? We are so happy for you. Welcome to the family, Elijah. We have so much to catch up on." She closed the distance, her arms outstretched, ready to claim her piece of my newly revealed success. She was ready to rewrite history right there in the living room, ready to pretend she had always supported me, ready to absorb Elijah's wealth into her own personal branding. But Elijah moved. He stepped smoothly in front of me, placing his large frame between my mother's grasping hands and my body. It was a subtle but immovable physical barrier. Brenda stopped short, her arms dropping to her sides, her fake smile faltering as she met Elijah's cold, calculating gaze. He looked down at her with an expression of profound disgust, completely rejecting her sudden attempt at familial warmth. Elijah did not say a word to her. He simply reached into the sleek leather briefcase he held in his free hand. He snapped the metallic locks open, the sharp sound echoing in the quiet room. He reached inside and pulled out a thick, heavy legal folder. He bypassed Brenda entirely, stepping toward my father, who was still leaning heavily against the polished wood of the grand piano. Elijah held the heavy folder out. Calvin, his hands trembling slightly, reached forward and took the documents. He stared down at the thick stack of paper, terror radiating from his eyes. He recognized the seal of his own corporate auditing firm on the front of the manila envelope. "I wouldn't celebrate just yet," Calvin Elijah said icily. The heavy manila folder trembled in Calvin's hands. The crisp rustle of thick, high-grade legal paper was the only sound breaking the suffocating tension in the room. Calvin's eyes darted frantically across the top page, his pupils dilating as he tried to process the dense paragraphs of financial legalese. I watched his gaze lock onto the letterhead. It was the logo of his primary banking institution, stamped directly next to the unmistakable crest of his own logistics company. Below that was a bold red watermark that radiated absolute finality. Notice of default. Calvin flipped wildly to the second page, then the third, his breathing turning into shallow, ragged gasps. The aggressive, domineering patriarch who had just spent the entire evening attempting to publicly humiliate me was evaporating right before my eyes. He looked up, his face entirely drained of color, his skin a sickly ashen gray. He opened his mouth to speak, but only a dry rattling sound came out. Maya coldly stepped out from the protective circle of Elijah's arm, though Elijah remained a steadfast, immovable presence right behind my shoulder. I looked directly at my father, allowing the silence to stretch for just a fraction of a second longer, letting the absolute terror of his new reality sink deep into his bones. "You always told me I lacked the head for complex investments, Dad," I said, my voice steady, carrying the calm authority of a woman who had built her own empire from scratch. "You spent the last 3 years bragging at every Sunday dinner about Preston's financial wizardry. You told anyone who would listen that your brilliant son-in-law was going to single-handedly save your failing logistics business and multiply your retirement portfolio. You completely ignored my warnings. You laughed when I suggested his returns looked mathematically impossible. Because he wore the right suits and played golf at the right country clubs, you handed him the keys to your entire life." Calvin's hands were shaking so violently now that the documents slipped from his grip, scattering across the Persian rug like dead leaves. He stared down at them, completely paralyzed. "Let me break it down for you, since Preston is currently unavailable for a consultation." I continued, gesturing toward the front door where the police were currently shoving my brother-in-law into the back of a squad car. 6 months ago, Preston convinced you that he had secured a massive private equity buyout for your logistics company. He told you that in order to finalize the deal, he needed you to temporarily leverage your assets to show liquid capital. You blindly trusted him. You allowed the Golden Child's husband to take full management control of your retirement accounts. And far worse, you signed the paperwork allowing him to use your pristine paid-off suburban mansion as collateral for a commercial bridge loan. Brenda let out a sharp, horrified gasp. She clutched her pearl necklace, her eyes darting between me and the scattered papers on the floor. Her entire identity was wrapped up in that sprawling colonial estate in the suburbs. It was the stage where she hosted her elite garden parties, the physical proof of her superiority over her peers. A bridge loan. Brenda choked out, her voice trembling with rising panic. Calvin, what is she talking about? Tell me she is lying. Tell me our home is fine. Calvin could not even look at his wife. He was staring at the floor, his broad shoulders slumped, looking like a man who had just been handed a death sentence. He did not secure a buyout, Mom, I said, shifting my gaze to the woman who had just tried to hug me, purely because she realized I was engaged to a billionaire. There was no private equity firm. The bridge loan was real, but the money did not go into the logistics company. Preston took the equity from your home and funneled it directly into the exact same offshore accounts he used to hide his embezzled client funds. He used your house to create a slush fund. And now that the federal authorities have seized every single one of Preston's accounts for grand larceny and wire fraud, that money is gone, frozen, unrecoverable. The sheer magnitude of the devastation hit the room like a physical shockwave. The remaining high society guests, the ones who had been too morbidly fascinated to follow Calvin's earlier orders to leave, were now whispering in hushed, horrified tones. The mighty Caldwell family was not just dealing with a scandal, they were being wiped off the map. The bank is officially foreclosing on your pristine suburban home, I stated, ensuring my voice remained completely devoid of sympathy. The paperwork in that folder includes the final notice. You have less than 30 days to vacate the property. But the tragedy does not stop there. The retirement funds you spent 40 years accumulating, the accounts you told me I would never inherit because I was a disappointment. They have been entirely drained to zero. I paused, letting my eyes sweep over Jasmine, who was still curled on the floor, looking completely broken. I looked back at my parents delivering the final crushing blow. You did not just fund Jasmine's lavish promotion party, I said quietly, making sure every syllable landed with devastating precision. Your life savings, the equity of the home you raised me, in the security you hoarded while telling me I was worthless, all of it went into the same pool of stolen money. You paid for the designer bags, you paid for the luxury vacations, and you paid for the penthouse suite downtown. Your retirement funds were drained to pay the rent for Preston's mistress. Brenda let out a sound that was barely human. It was a guttural, ragged wail of pure agony. The sheer indignity of it was too much for her fragile, status-obsessed ego to bear. Her beloved son-in-law, the man she had weaponized against me for years, had taken her life savings and used it to house the woman he was sleeping with behind her favorite daughter's back. It was the ultimate, inescapable humiliation, and it was happening right in front of the very church friends and socialites she had spent her life trying to impress. You are entirely bankrupt, I said, delivering the final verdict. You have absolutely nothing left. The absolute arrogance that had defined Brenda's entire existence drained from her face, leaving behind a hollow, terrifying void. Her knees buckled under the weight of her ruined reality. She dropped to the floor right next to the scattered foreclosure documents, her expensive cream suit pooling around her on the rug. The illusion of her elite status had been violently stripped away, leaving a desperate, impoverished woman terrified of facing the real world. She looked up at me. Her eyes were red, her mascara running down her cheeks in dark, jagged streaks. She saw the multi-million-dollar software company on the television screen. She saw the devastating evidence of her ruins scattered on the floor. And she saw Elijah, a billionaire titan of industry, standing loyally by my side, his hand resting supportively on the small of my back. The calculation happened instantly. Brenda's survival instinct flared one last time. She reached out her manicured hands, scrambling across the rug until she grabbed hold of my ankles. "Maya," she cried, her voice cracking as she looked up at me with wide, pleading eyes. She deployed the exact same manipulation tactic she had relied on for my entire life, attempting to weaponize family loyalty the second it benefited her. "Maya, baby. Please." Brenda sobbed, the tears flowing freely now. "You are so successful. We had no idea. We are so incredibly proud of you. You and Elijah have to save us. You have the money. He has the capital. You can pay off the bank. You can stop the foreclosure. We are your family. We are your flesh and blood. You cannot let us lose our home. You cannot leave us with nothing." Brenda's desperate, grasping hands clawed at the hem of my shirt. She was weeping, a pathetic display of shattered pride, begging for my newly revealed wealth to rescue her from the financial crater Preston had dug. But before I could even formulate a response to my mother's sudden and entirely self-serving maternal affection, a high-pitched shriek shattered the remaining tension in the room. Jasmine scrambled up from the floor, her designer gown twisted and stained with spilled champagne. She ignored her mother begging at my feet. She ignored her husband, who was currently being shoved through the grand mahogany front doors by Detective Rollins, his wrists securely bound in steel. Instead, Jasmine directed all her venom entirely at me. Her face was contorted into an ugly, unrecognizable mask of pure entitlement and fury. She stomped her heel into the Persian rug, her eyes wild. "You owe us!" Jasmine screamed, the sound tearing through her throat. "You planned this to destroy me. You waited until the biggest night of my life to ruin my marriage and steal my spotlight. You set Preston up because you could never stand seeing me happy. You have to fix this, Maya. You owe us." The sheer delusion radiating from my younger sister was breathtaking. She was standing in a house paid for by stolen funds, wearing jewelry bought with embezzled money, watching her fraudster husband get carted off to federal prison, and she still believed I was the villain of her story. She still believed the universe and my bank account revolved entirely around her comfort. I looked down at my mother, who was still clutching my pant leg. I looked past her to my father Calvin, who was leaning heavily against the grand piano, as if the instrument was the only thing keeping him from collapsing into a pile of dust. And finally, I looked directly at my ruined, hysterical sister. I gently placed my hand over Elijah's arm, which was still wrapped protectively around my waist, and took a single step forward. The remaining guests in the room held their collective breath. I leaned in close to Jasmine, letting my voice drop to a low, razor-sharp whisper that carried through the dead silence of the living room. "I owe you," I asked, tilting my head slightly. "I am just the ugly, unemployed dropout who is only good for washing dishes. Remember? Those were your exact words to me yesterday when I asked if we could hire a cleaning crew for this party." Jasmine flinched, her mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. She had no defense because I was simply repeating the reality she had forced upon me for decades. I turned my attention to Calvin, who was sweating profusely, his eyes darting frantically around the room as if searching for a magical escape hatch. I decided to strip away every last illusion he held about his parenting. I wanted the high society gossip still lingering in the foyer to hear exactly how the great Caldwell family operated behind closed doors. "Do not stand there and pretend this is a sudden tragedy, Dad," I said, raising my voice so it echoed against the vaulted ceilings. "You laid the foundation for this total collapse years ago. You groomed Jasmine to believe she deserved the world on a silver platter without ever having to work for it. And you groomed me to believe I was nothing more than the dirt beneath her shoes. You did not just favor her. You actively tried to erase me." Calvin swallowed hard, his hands trembling against the polished wood of the piano. "Maya, please," he rasped, his voice barely a whisper. "Not in front of everyone." "Oh, we are absolutely doing this in front of everyone," I fired back, refusing to break eye contact. "Let us talk about family loyalty. Let us talk about Thanksgiving 5 years ago." I was 30 years old, working 3 separate freelance jobs to build the capital for my software company. I came to your house exhausted, looking for a little family warmth. You forced me to sit at a folding card table in the hallway with the young children because Preston had invited his wealthy business partners, and you told me my cheap clothes would ruin the aesthetic of the main dining room. You literally banished your own daughter to the hallway so you could impress a man who was already planning to steal your retirement fund. My mother let out a small, strangled whimper from the floor, but I did not stop. The floodgates were open and the truth was pouring out like a tidal wave. "And what about my business?" I asked, stepping closer to Calvin, forcing him to look at the woman he had underestimated. When I designed the first algorithm for my platform, I needed a tiny $10,000 business loan to secure the patent. I came to you with a meticulously researched 60-page business plan. I begged you to just co-sign the loan, not to pay for it, just to co-sign. Do you remember what you told me? Calvin squeezed his eyes shut, shaking his head. I did not want to risk my credit, he mumbled pathetically. You told me I lacked the intellectual capacity to survive in the tech industry. I corrected him, making sure every syllable landed like a physical blow. You laughed in my face, handed my business plan back to me, and said you would never put your good name on a guaranteed failure. And the very next morning, less than 24 hours later, you wired Jasmine $80,000 in cash so she could buy a custom Tesla because she complained her luxury SUV was the wrong shade of white. Jasmine crossed her arms over her chest, trying to maintain her defiant posture, but her lower lip was trembling violently. You bought her a car to match her purse and you left me to drown, I said, the absolute coldness in my voice chilling the room. You told me I was on my own. So I took you at your word. I sold my car. I slept on a mattress on the floor of a studio apartment for 2 years. I coded for 18 hours a day. I built my company line by line, client by client, while you all paraded around playing high society with Preston's dirty money. And now you expect me to open my wallet and save the very house you banished me from. Brenda finally let go of my ankles. She shrank back, pulling her knees to her chest, her face buried in her hands. The reality of her actions laid bare in front of her social circle was a humiliation she could not escape. She had bet everything on the wrong child, and she had lost spectacularly. Calvin pushed himself off the piano. He wiped the sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand and tried to pull his shoulders back, attempting one final desperate play for control. He tried to twist the narrative, tried to frame his lifelong abuse as some sort of brilliant, calculated parenting strategy. "We did our best," Maya Calvin said, his voice taking on a pleading, victimized tone. "We saw your potential. We knew you were smart. We pushed you. We were hard on you so you would be strong. We knew you needed tough love to succeed in the real world. You should be thanking us. Look at what you accomplished because we challenged you." I stared at him. I looked at the man who had spent my entire life breaking my spirit, currently trying to take credit for the empire I had built with my own 2 hands. A short, sharp laugh escaped my lips. It was a bitter, hollow sound that offered absolutely no comfort. "You did not push me to be strong," I said, my voice completely devoid of any remaining warmth or familial obligation. "You buried me so Jasmine could shine. You shoved me deep into the dirt because my existence was inconvenient to your perfect family narrative. You tried to suffocate me so she could have all the sunlight." I turned my body, wrapping my hand around Elijah's arm, feeling the solid, unwavering support of the man who actually knew my worth. I looked back at Calvin, my eyes locking onto his terrified, bankrupt gaze. "But you forgot one thing about burying seeds," I said smoothly. I turned my face up to Elijah, who was looking down at me with a fierce, proud smile. I let the silence stretch for a moment, letting the absolute finality of my victory settle over the ruined family I was leaving behind. They grow in the dark. The silence that followed my words was absolute and heavy, pressing down on the grand living room like a physical weight. Elijah's arm remained securely around my waist, an immovable pillar of support, while Calvin stared at me as if I had just spoken to him in a foreign language. The realization that he had buried the wrong daughter, the daughter who had ultimately outgrown his shadow and built a legitimate empire, left him completely paralyzed. He had nothing left to say. His logistics business was ruined, his house was in foreclosure, and his golden son-in-law was a common criminal. But my mother Brenda possessed a survival instinct forged in the fires of high society social climbing. She had spent her entire life twisting narratives to suit her needs, and she was not about to stop now simply because the truth was staring her in the face. Brenda realized instantly that playing the emotionally devastated pleading mother was not going to work on me. She saw the cold, unforgiving look in my eyes and knew the familial loyalty card had expired. So with the breathtaking agility of a cornered predator, she pivoted. She let go of my ankles, pushed herself up from the Persian rug, and frantically smoothed down the wrinkled front of her tailored cream suit. She turned her back on me and faced the remaining guests, the 40 elite members of Atlanta society, who were still standing in the foyer watching the drama unfold with morbid fascination. Brenda pointed a shaking manicured finger directly at the front door, where Detective Rollins was currently shoving Preston into the back of a police cruiser. "We were victims too!" Brenda cried out, her voice pitching into a hysterical theatrical wail perfectly calibrated for her country club audience. She pressed the back of her hand against her forehead, portraying the ultimate betrayed matriarch. "He manipulated us. He manipulated all of us. Calvin and I are entirely innocent in this nightmare. We trusted Preston. We welcomed him into our home and gave him our beautiful daughter. We thought he was a brilliant financial mind. We had absolutely no idea he was a monster." Brenda turned back to me, her eyes wide and shining with manufactured tears. She clasped her hands together in front of her chest, stepping forward as if she were approaching a judge for clemency. "Maya, you have to believe us," Brenda pleaded, her voice trembling with perfect dramatic timing. "We did not know anything about his offshore accounts. We did not know he was taking money from his investors. He used Calvin's business. He used our family home without us understanding the legal implications. We are ruined because we loved him too much. We were just naive, Maya. We are victims of his deceit, just like you." I looked at the woman who had birthed me. I looked at the sheer, unadulterated desperation in her eyes as she tried to spin a web of lies while standing in the middle of a crime scene. She was willing to throw Preston entirely under the bus, a man she had worshipped for 3 years, if it meant salvaging her own reputation in front of her wealthy friends. She wanted absolution. She wanted me to publicly validate her victimhood so she could walk away from this disaster with her head held high. I did not let her off the hook. I pulled my tablet from my leather tote bag once again. The massive 85-inch smart television above the marble fireplace flickered, clearing the foreclosure documents and awaiting my next command. I tapped the screen, loading the final, most damning piece of the encrypted dossier I had sent to the federal authorities. "You didn't know about the mistress, Mom," I said, my voice cutting through her theatrical sobbing like a serrated blade. "I will gladly concede that point. You had absolutely no idea he was housing another woman 3 blocks away from Jasmine. That part was a genuine surprise to you." Brenda nodded vigorously, sensing a lifeline. "Yes, exactly," she agreed eagerly. "We were completely in the dark. We had no idea he was capable of such vulgar behavior." "But you knew he was stealing," I stated smoothly. Brenda froze. The manufactured tears instantly stopped falling. "You knew the money was dirty." I continued, stepping around the coffee table so there was nothing standing between us. "You knew his corporate accounts were illegitimate. You just did not care where the cash was coming from as long as it kept flowing into your pockets." "That is a lie," Brenda shrieked, panic entirely consuming her features. "You are lying. You are just trying to humiliate me." I did not argue with her. I simply swiped my finger across the glass screen of my tablet. The television illuminated the room with a massive, high-resolution image of a private banking ledger. It was a side-by-side comparison. On the left was an American Express Platinum credit card statement registered under Brenda's name. On the right was an automated wire transfer log from one of Preston's dummy shell corporations, Apex Logistics Solutions. I turned to the crowd of socialites huddled in the foyer, ensuring they had a perfect view of the screen. I wanted them to see exactly how their friend funded her fabulous lifestyle. "Last year, you dug yourself into a massive financial hole trying to maintain your image," I explained, pointing at the credit card statement on the television. You spent $50,000 in 6 months. You bought designer clothes, hosted ridiculous charity luncheons, and booked first-class flights to Europe. You ran up a $50,000 debt that you knew Calvin could not pay because his logistics company was already circling the drain. You were terrified that your friends would find out you were broke. I looked back at Brenda, whose face had turned the color of chalk. "So you went to Preston," I said, my voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling. "And Preston miraculously paid off your entire $50,000 credit card balance in a single lump sum." I gestured to the wire transfer log on the right side of the screen. The highlighted row showed a transfer of exactly $50,000 from Preston's fraudulent corporate account directly to American Express, labeled under the memo section as a generic business expense. You knew Preston's legitimate salary did not cover massive random bailouts for his mother-in-law. I continued, tearing away the last shred of her dignity. You knew Calvin's business was failing. You knew the numbers did not add up, but you saw the transfer clear your balance hit zero, and you looked the other way. You willingly turned a blind eye to his embezzlement because he was funding your addiction to high society. You are not a victim, Mom. You are an accomplice. The reaction from the foyer was devastating. The elite guests, the very people Brenda had spent her entire life trying to impress and emulate, turned on her instantly. The society women gasped audibly, clutching their evening bags and pulling away from the center of the room. I watched Mrs. Higgins, the president of my mother's church committee, shake her head in absolute disgust. "Loot. Stolen money," one woman whispered loudly to her husband. "She paid her debts with stolen money. How incredibly vulgar." "I cannot believe we ever invited her to the country club," another voice hissed from the back of the crowd. "She's entirely bankrupt morally and financially." Brenda heard every single whisper. She heard the harsh, unforgiving judgment of the people she worshipped. Her pristine, carefully curated image shattered into a million irreparable pieces in real time. The social currency she valued more than her own children had just plummeted to zero, and there was no way to buy it back. Brenda let out a low, agonizing wail. She dropped to her knees right there in the center of the Persian rug. She did not fall because she felt remorse for her actions. She did not fall because she realized how terribly she had treated me. She collapsed entirely out of absolute social humiliation. The realization that she would be banished from her elite circles, that she would be the subject of endless vicious gossip for the rest of her life, broke her completely. She covered her head with her arms and sobbed into the floor. But the ultimate destruction of the Caldwell family was not yet complete. From the velvet sofa, a slow, ragged breath hitched in the silence. Jasmine slowly pushed herself up to a seated position. Her mascara was smeared down her cheeks. Her designer gown ruined her perfect life, completely decimated. She stared at the television screen, her eyes tracing the line connecting Preston's stolen funds to our mother's credit card statement. Jasmine's mind, which usually operated on superficial matters, finally connected the horrifying dots. "You knew," Jasmine whispered, her voice trembling as she stared at the top of Brenda's head. Brenda flinched, refusing to look up from the floor. "You knew he was stealing, and you took his money." Jasmine shrieked, her voice escalating into a deafening roar as she stumbled to her feet. "You let him pay off your stupid credit cards with stolen funds while he was out buying a penthouse for his mistress." Jasmine lunged forward, her hands curling into claws. She stood over Brenda, her face twisted with a level of hatred I had never seen before. "You sold me out," Jasmine screamed, the sound tearing through the grand living room. "You let him ruin my life so you could buy designer clothes. You knew he was a criminal, and you took his dirty money while he was cheating on me. You are the reason I'm going to lose my house. You are the reason my husband is going to prison." Brenda finally snapped her head up, her own survival instincts clashing violently with her daughter's rage. She scrambled backward on the rug, pointing a shaking finger back at Jasmine. "Do not you dare blame me for your failed marriage," Brenda screamed back, entirely abandoning any pretense of maternal affection. "I took that money to save this family. I took that money to maintain our reputation. If you had actually kept your husband satisfied, maybe he would not have needed to move a 25-year-old into a penthouse suite. You drove him away with your endless complaining and your constant need for attention." Jasmine let out an animalistic scream and lunged at her mother. The perfect family facade violently tore itself apart in front of the entire room. The golden child and the narcissistic matriarch collided in a flurry of grabbing hands, tearing silk and vicious, unforgiving insults. They screamed at each other, pulling hair and throwing accusations, entirely destroying the bond they had paraded around for 30 years. The alliance they had formed to keep me down was completely annihilated, replaced by the ugly, chaotic reality of two selfish women turning on each other the moment the money ran out. I did not try to stop them. I did not call out for them to calm down. I simply turned my back on the wreckage. I looked up at Elijah, who was watching the scene with cool, detached observation. He met my eyes, his expression softening instantly into a look of profound respect and adoration. He offered me his arm. I looped my hand through his, feeling the solid, unwavering strength of the man I loved. Together we walked out the front door, leaving the shattered remains of my family screaming in the dark. The piercing shrieks of my mother and sister tearing into each other echoed off the vaulted ceilings, a chaotic symphony of shattered egos and ruined lives. They were entirely consumed by their mutual hatred, hurling vicious insults that stripped away 30 years of forced family perfection. I stood beside Elijah, my hand resting securely in the crook of his arm, watching the two women who had made my life a living nightmare finally direct their venom at each other. But the grand finale of the Caldwell family's destruction was not yet over. Detective Rollins cleared his throat, a deep booming sound that instantly commanded the room and sliced through the hysterical screaming match. He tightened his steel grip on the back of Preston's ruined designer suit jacket, forcefully jerking the disgraced finance executive upright. "Mr. Preston, you have the right to remain silent," Detective Rollins announced, his voice carrying the undeniable heavy weight of absolute authority. "Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford an attorney, one will be provided for you." The recitation of the Miranda rights in the center of an elite-rented Buckhead mansion was surreal. It was a stark, brutal injection of reality into a space that had been entirely constructed on lies. The two uniformed officers stepped forward, flanking Preston, their hands resting cautiously on their duty belts as they prepared to march the felon out the front door. Preston stopped struggling. The realization that he was actually going to federal prison finally seemed to penetrate his thick skull. His face, usually a mask of arrogant, calculated charm, contorted into something ugly and feral. He looked down at Jasmine, who was still kneeling on the Persian rug, weeping uncontrollably over the loss of her social status and her stolen wealth. Preston let out a harsh, barking laugh that sounded completely unhinged. "You actually think you are the victim here, Jasmine?" Preston sneered, his voice dripping with pure, unadulterated vitriol. He pulled against the officer's restraints just enough to lean toward his sobbing wife. "You are nothing but a parasite. You bled me dry from the second I put that ring on your finger. You think I wanted to fund your pathetic, endless country club luncheons? You think I wanted to buy you a custom Tesla just so you could impress a bunch of bored housewives who secretly hate you?" Jasmine gasped, her tear-streaked face snapping upward to look at the man she had worshipped. She opened her mouth to scream back at him, but Preston did not let her speak. "I stole that money because nothing was ever enough for you," Preston yelled, the veins bulging in his neck. "You and your greedy, status-obsessed mother treated me like a blank check. You demanded the penthouse lifestyle on a middle management reality. You are a shallow, empty gold digger, Jasmine. You drained every ounce of life out of me. The only peace I got was when I was in that suite downtown with someone who actually appreciated me. You deserve to lose everything." Jasmine let out an animalistic shriek, burying her face in her hands as the ultimate public humiliation washed over her. Her husband was not just going to prison. He was loudly declaring to the entire upper echelon of Atlanta society that she was an insufferable burden. Preston then turned his wild, frantic gaze toward Calvin. My father was still leaning heavily against the grand piano, his face gray and completely devoid of his usual domineering presence. He looked like a deflated balloon, a man who had just watched his entire legacy burn to ash in a matter of minutes. Preston locked eyes with the patriarch who had enabled his crimes, the man who had gladly looked the other way as long as the cash kept flowing into his failing logistics business. Preston curled his lip, hawked loudly, and spat directly at Calvin's feet. The saliva landed with a sickening smack on the polished toe of Calvin's expensive leather shoe. "Enjoy your foreclosure, old man," Preston spat. "You are just as guilty as I am." The 40 elite guests, the absolute pinnacle of the city's social registry, gasped in unison. But they did not look away. They did not turn their backs to give the family privacy. Instead, the living room was suddenly illuminated by the harsh artificial glow of dozens of smartphone screens. The socialites and investors had their phones raised high in the air. The little red recording dots blinked steadily from every corner of the room. Camera flashes went off in rapid succession, capturing Jasmine sobbing on the floor, Brenda pulling her hair in despair, and Preston being manhandled by the Atlanta Police Department. The very people Calvin and Brenda had spent decades trying to impress were now live streaming their absolute downfall to the rest of the world. They were zooming in on the handcuffs. They were recording the spittle on Calvin's shoe. This was the biggest, juiciest scandal the city had seen in a decade, and the guests were ensuring that the Caldwell family would never, ever be able to show their faces in public again. Calvin slowly lifted his head, his eyes tracking the sea of glowing screens. The reality of his social and professional execution finally registered. His business was bankrupt, his home was foreclosed, and now his total humiliation was being broadcasted. He snapped. The sheer terror of becoming a public laughingstock overrode whatever rational thought he had left. Calvin pushed himself off the grand piano, his face flushing a dangerous, violent shade of crimson. He lunged wildly toward the center of the room, charging directly at Mrs. Higgins, who had her phone aimed squarely at Brenda's weeping face. "Put that away right now!" Calvin roared, his voice cracking with panicked desperation. He swung his large arms, trying to physically block the camera lenses. "This is a private residence. Turn those devices off immediately. Have some decency. I demand you stop recording my family." He reached out, his thick fingers grasping aggressively for Mrs. Higgins's phone. The elderly socialite shrieked and stumbled backward, her heels catching on the edge of the rug. Calvin kept coming, driven by the blind need to protect his non-existent reputation. He was entirely out of control, ready to physically assault his own guests to stop the footage from hitting the internet. But before Calvin could even close his hand around the device, Elijah moved. He did not rush, he did not yell. He simply glided across the floor with terrifying speed and absolute imposing grace. Elijah stepped smoothly between Calvin and the terrified socialite, planting his large custom-suited frame like an immovable brick wall. Calvin slammed into Elijah's chest and bounced off, staggering backward as if he had run into a concrete pillar. Calvin looked up, panting heavily, his fists clenched, ready to fight his way through. But the moment he met Elijah's eyes, the fight instantly drained out of him. Elijah looked down at my father with an expression of pure, icy disdain. The billionaire tech magnate radiated a quiet, dangerous power that completely dwarfed Calvin's desperate, sweaty aggression. Elijah did not raise his voice. He did not need to. "Your privacy vanished the moment you humiliated my fiancé in front of these people," Elijah stated smoothly, his deep voice carrying flawlessly over the chaos of the room. "You wanted an audience for her destruction, Calvin. Now you have an audience for your own. Step back." Calvin shrank away, physically diminishing under the weight of Elijah's command. He dropped his hands to his sides, completely emasculated and entirely defeated. He had no power left. He had no money left. And he had absolutely no authority over the man standing in front of him. Detective Rollins took that momentary pause in the chaos to finish his job. "Move," Rollins ordered, shoving Preston firmly between the shoulder blades. The two officers marched my disgraced brother-in-law through the grand mahogany front doors and out onto the wide stone porch. I walked out right behind them, Elijah's hand resting securely on the small of my back, guiding me through the sea of whispering guests. Calvin, unable to help himself, stumbled out the front door behind us, followed closely by a trailing crowd of socialites eager to capture the final act of the tragedy. The cool, humid night air washed over my face, a refreshing contrast to the suffocating tension inside the rented mansion. The sweeping circular driveway was bathed in the harsh, flashing red and blue strobe lights of 3 parked police cruisers. The officers marched Preston down the grand stone steps, pushing his head down to clear the doorframe before shoving him roughly into the back seat of the squad car. The heavy metal door slammed shut, sealing Preston in his new permanent reality. I stood on the top step watching the police cruiser idle in the driveway, feeling a profound, absolute sense of liberation. The man who had financed my misery was gone. But Elijah, the man who calculated his moves 10 steps ahead of everyone else, was not quite finished. He pulled his phone from his pocket, checked the glowing screen, and offered me a brilliant, razor-sharp smile. Right on time, Elijah murmured, his voice a low rumble beside my ear. I looked up just as 2 sleek black luxury SUVs turned sharply into the grand driveway, their headlights cutting through the flashing police strobes. The heavy vehicles pulled to a smooth stop directly behind the police cruisers. The doors opened in unison, and 4 men stepped out. They were dressed in sharp, conservative gray suits, carrying thick clipboards and heavy manila envelopes. They moved with coordinated corporate precision, completely ignoring the police presence. They were bank representatives. Elijah had not just exposed Preston's crimes and Calvin's financial ruin to the room. He had legally weaponized the information. The moment I handed him the encrypted dossier earlier that afternoon, his legal team had notified the primary creditors holding the loans on Calvin's accounts and properties. Elijah had triggered the corporate fail-safes before the party even began. The lead representative, a stern-faced man with silver hair, marched up the stone steps, bypassing the whispering guests entirely. He walked directly up to Calvin, who was standing near the massive stone columns, shivering in the night air, despite the humidity. Calvin Caldwell, the representative, asked, his voice entirely devoid of emotion. Calvin nodded slowly, his eyes wide with rising terror, as he stared at the thick envelopes in the man's hands. The representative held out the documents, pressing them firmly into Calvin's chest. "I am serving you with the official notice of immediate foreclosure and asset seizure," the man stated loudly, ensuring the recording socialites caught every word. "These documents pertain to this current rental property, your corporate logistics headquarters, and your primary residence in the suburbs. Your accounts have been locked by federal mandate. You are required to vacate all premises immediately. Have a good evening." The thick manila envelope hit Calvin's chest with a dull, heavy thud. He reflexively brought his arms up, his trembling hands clutching the documents to his sternum, as if the paper itself possessed a physical weight that was driving him into the stone porch. He stared blankly at the silver-haired bank representative, his jaw working uselessly, completely unable to form a single coherent syllable. The representative did not wait for a response. He simply offered a curt, razor-sharp nod, turned on his heel, and signaled his 3 associates to begin posting the brightly colored legal notices of seizure on the massive mahogany front doors. The sharp, abrasive sound of heavy-duty tape ripping across the pristine woodwork broke the hypnotic spell that had held the 40 elite guests captive in the foyer. The realization hit the crowd with the brutal force of a physical blow. The champagne they had been sipping, the delicate caviar canapés they had been fed, the very ground they were standing on, every single luxurious detail of this evening, had been funded by stolen money. They were standing inside an active crime scene, eating the proceeds of a federal embezzlement scheme hosted by a family that was now completely irrevocably bankrupt. In the ruthless, hyper-competitive ecosystem of Atlanta's high society, there was nothing more offensive, nothing more toxic than financial ruin. Poverty was a disease, but exposed fraudulent wealth was a death sentence. Mr. Sterling, a prominent hedge fund manager who had spent the last hour listening to Calvin boast about his logistics empire, simply opened his hand. His crystal champagne flute dropped directly onto the imported stone patio, shattering into 100 glittering shards. That sharp crash was the starting gun. The great exodus began. The guests moved as a singular panicked organism. They surged past Calvin, giving him a wide, disgusted berth, as if the foreclosure notices in his hands were highly contagious. They shoved their way out the front doors, their expensive leather shoes crunching over the broken crystal glass, completely abandoning their curated manners in their desperate rush to escape the blast radius of the Caldwell family's destruction. Brenda snapped out of her paralyzed state on the living room floor. She scrambled up, her cream suit wrinkled and stained, her carefully styled hair falling wildly around her face. She sprinted toward the grand entryway, her heels clicking frantically against the hardwood. She threw herself into the middle of the fleeing crowd, physically throwing her arms out to block the exit. "Wait!" Brenda shrieked, her voice cracking with a manic, desperate edge. "Please, you do not understand. There has been a terrible mistake. It is just a minor clerical error. The bank is overreacting. Calvin will have this sorted out by tomorrow morning. Please, the catering staff is just about to serve the main course." She reached out and grabbed the silk sleeve of Sylvia Higgins, the immensely powerful president of the country club's admissions committee. Sylvia was the woman Brenda had spent 5 years kissing up to, the woman whose approval dictated the social hierarchy of their entire neighborhood. Sylvia, Brenda pleaded, her fingers digging desperately into the expensive fabric. "Sylvia, you know us. You know we are good people. Please stay. Let us open a bottle of the reserve vintage." Sylvia recoiled with a level of visceral disgust, usually reserved for stepping in biological waste. She violently yanked her arm back, tearing her silk sleeve out of Brenda's grasp. She looked my mother up and down, her eyes narrowing into cold, unforgiving slits. "Do not touch me, Brenda." Sylvia hissed, her voice loud enough for the entire fleeing crowd to hear. "You have the audacity to invite us to a property paid for by stolen funds. You sat next to me at church on Sunday wearing jewelry bought with the life savings of defrauded investors. You are absolutely pathetic. Your membership at the club is revoked effectively immediately, and if you ever attempt to contact me again, I will have my attorneys file a restraining order." Sylvia adjusted her cashmere wrap, turned her back on my mother, and marched down the stone steps toward the valet stand. Brenda let out a shattered, breathless gasp. She stumbled backward, clutching her chest as if she had been physically shot. But the nightmare was only just beginning. Guest after guest streamed past her, entirely ignoring her pathetic, weeping pleas. Men who had played golf with Calvin for decades refused to even look in his direction. Women who had attended Brenda's lavish luncheons actively shielded their faces with their designer bags, treating the Caldwells like absolute pariahs. I stood on the edge of the stone porch, Elijah's arm resting like a shield across my lower back, and watched the brutal efficiency of high society excommunication. The valets were running frantically, pulling luxury sedans and sports cars up to the circular driveway. Doors slammed in rapid succession. Engines roared to life. Tires squealed against the gravel as the city's elite raced away from the toxic wreckage of my family. Within 10 minutes, the entire driveway was completely empty, save for Elijah's 2 waiting security vehicles and the bank representative's black SUVs. The silence that settled over the sprawling estate was absolute and deafening. The flashing blue and red lights of the police cruisers had long since faded down the winding suburban road, taking Preston with them. The catering staff had quietly packed their equipment and fled out the service entrance the moment the bank representatives taped the seizure notices to the kitchen doors. It was just us, the ruined Caldwells, standing in the ruins of their fabricated kingdom. Brenda stood perfectly still in the center of the grand entryway. The manic energy had completely burned out of her system, leaving behind a hollow, terrifying realization. She looked around the cavernous, echoing mansion. She looked at the bright yellow foreclosure notices slapped onto the mahogany doors. She looked at her husband, who was sitting on the bottom step of the porch, his head buried in his hands, softly weeping into the legal documents that proved he was entirely penniless. In less than 60 minutes, Brenda had lost her country club, standing her church, standing her social circle, her home, her retirement fund, and her entire identity. She had absolutely nothing left. She was the one thing she hated more than anything else in the world. She was poor. Her shoulders began to shake. She spun around slowly, her eyes wide and wild, searching the empty driveway for a lifeline. Her gaze dragged across the abandoned valet stand, swept past her weeping husband, and finally locked onto me. She saw me standing tall, perfectly composed, wearing a simple but immaculately tailored suit, leaning against the most powerful billionaire in the state of Georgia. She saw the wealth radiating from Elijah, the undeniable, impenetrable security that surrounded him. The deeply ingrained parasitic entitlement that fueled Brenda's entire existence roared back to life. She completely ignored the decades of emotional abuse she had subjected me to. She ignored the fact that she had just publicly disowned me less than an hour ago. She marched toward the edge of the porch, her tear-streaked face twisting into a mask of desperate, frantic demand. Maya Brenda cried out, her voice echoing shrilly in the quiet night air. She pointed a shaking finger at the foreclosure documents crushed in Calvin's hands. "You can fix this. You have to fix this right now. You are the CEO of a major software firm. You are marrying a billionaire. You have the money." She scrambled up the first stone step, her eyes locked onto my face with a terrifying predatory intensity. "You can just pay off the bridge loan." Brenda demanded, her words tumbling over each other in a desperate rush. "You can wire the funds to the bank tomorrow morning. You can clear Calvin's debts. We can get the house back. We can hire a crisis management firm to spin the story. We can say Preston acted entirely alone, and we were completely victimized. You have the power to make this all go away, Maya. Just pay off the debt. For family. You owe your family." I looked down at the woman who had birthed me. I looked at the sheer, breathtaking audacity required to demand financial salvation from the exact same daughter she had banished to the hallway on Thanksgiving simply because my clothes were not expensive enough. I looked at Calvin, who had lifted his head from his hands, his tear-filled eyes suddenly sparkling with a pathetic, desperate spark of hope. They actually believed I was going to save them. They actually believed the invisible bonds of familial obligation would force me to open my checkbook and buy back the very chains they had used to hold me down. I slowly detached myself from Elijah's side. I took 2 measured steps forward, closing the distance between myself and my mother. I looked down at the bright yellow foreclosure notice plastered to the front door. I read the total outstanding balance printed in bold black ink. I turned my gaze back to Brenda. My face was completely devoid of anger, sadness, or vindication. There was only icy, absolute detachment. "I could pay it off with the cash in my purse right now," I said quietly, my voice perfectly level. Brenda's breath hitched. A massive, hysterical smile broke across her ruined face. Her eyes lit up with brilliant, blinding hope. She reached her hands out toward me, ready to pull me into an embrace, ready to welcome me back into the fold as the savior of the Caldwell Empire. Calvin let out a loud, shuddering sigh of relief from the steps below. I let them feel the warmth of that hope for exactly 3 seconds. But I won't spend a single cent to save the people who watched me drown. The crushing weight of my words slammed into Brenda with the force of a physical blow. The frantic, manufactured hope that had just illuminated her tear-streaked face vanished instantly, replaced by a hollow, gaping terror. She opened her mouth to speak, to beg, to offer some pathetic justification for the decades of psychological torture she had subjected me to, but no sound came out. She simply slumped backward onto the Persian rug, her hands falling limply to her sides. She finally understood that the bank account she desperately needed was permanently closed to her. I did not offer her a second glance. I turned my body slightly, preparing to walk out the front doors with Elijah and leave the Caldwell family to the wreckage they had built for themselves. But the silence in the grand living room was suddenly shattered by a piercing, guttural shriek. Jasmine staggered backward, her ruined silk designer gown snagging violently on the sharp edge of the glass coffee table. She stumbled, losing her footing entirely, and collapsed hard onto the velvet sofa. Her hands gripped the luxurious fabric as if it were the edge of a cliff, her knuckles turning white from the strain. The absolute reality of the bank representatives in the driveway, the bright yellow foreclosure notices on the mahogany doors, and the flashing police lights reflecting against the windows, had finally penetrated the thick, impenetrable layer of delusion she had wrapped herself in for years. "I have nothing!" Jasmine screamed, the sound tearing through her throat with raw, unadulterated panic. She looked around the cavernous living room, her eyes wide, darting frantically from the vaulted ceilings to the expensive artwork she no longer owned. My husband is a criminal. I have no job and my accounts are frozen. Where am I supposed to go? She buried her face in her hands, her body rocking back and forth as she wailed. For the first time in her 30 years of existence, the golden child was facing a problem that could not be solved by daddy's credit card or her husband's fraudulent bank accounts. The safety net was gone, and the free fall was terrifying. Calvin, who was still clutching the official notice of immediate foreclosure, felt the last remaining shreds of his patriarchal authority slipping away. The humiliation of being served legal papers in front of his fleeing high society guests was too much for his fragile, domineering ego to bear. He needed a target. He needed someone to absorb the crushing, suffocating weight of his own profound failures. He could not blame himself, and he could no longer blame me. He spun around his face, flushing a dangerous, violent shade of purple, and aimed his fury directly at his favorite daughter. "This is your fault!" Calvin bellowed, his voice echoing violently off the walls and cutting through Jasmine's hysterical sobbing. He took a heavy, aggressive step toward the velvet sofa, pointing a shaking, accusatory finger directly at her face. "You had to have the luxury lifestyle," Calvin roared, the veins bulging prominently in his thick neck. "You forced him to steal. You drove that man to absolute ruin with your endless, insatiable greed. You needed the country club memberships. You needed the $50,000 kitchen renovations for a kitchen you never even cook in. You humiliated him every single time he tried to put you on a budget. You held his manhood hostage until he gave you the black credit cards. You drained him dry, Jasmine, until he had to steal from innocent investors just to keep you from throwing your pathetic tantrums." Jasmine stopped crying. The accusation hit her perfectly curated ego like a freight train. The weeping, helpless victim persona she had adopted just seconds prior instantly evaporated, replaced by a pure, venomous, defensive rage. She pushed herself up from the sofa, her chest heaving, her tear-streaked face twisting into an ugly snarl. "You are blaming me!" Jasmine shrieked, her voice cracking with fury as she marched toward the center of the room. "You pathetic, weak old man! You are blaming me for your own absolute incompetence!" She closed the distance between them, completely abandoning any remaining respect she held for her father. The gloves were off and the claws were out. "Do not stand there and pretend you were a successful, legitimate businessman." Jasmine spat, her face inches from Calvin's chest. "We all knew your logistics company was a sinking ship. You bled money for a decade. I remember the screaming matches you had with Mom in the kitchen when the bank denied your second mortgage. You were terrified of losing your status in this neighborhood. So when Preston came along flashing his fake wealth and his tailored suits, you threw me at him." Calvin flinched, his eyes darting away, but Jasmine relentlessly pursued him, backing him up against the grand piano. "You practically sold me to him because you needed a bailout," Jasmine screamed. "You begged him to invest in your empty warehouses. You begged him to cover your corporate payroll. You willingly signed the paperwork allowing him to take over your retirement accounts because you were too stupid to manage them yourself. You knew exactly what he was doing. You saw the impossible returns. You saw the offshore routing numbers. You just looked the other way because it kept your country club dues paid. You are a coward, Dad. A complete, utter coward who used his son-in-law's dirty money to play pretend." I stood in the grand entryway, the cool night air drifting in from the open front doors, and watched the spectacular carnage unfold. Elijah stood silently at my side, his presence a constant grounding force in the storm of their destruction. I did not feel the urge to intervene. I did not feel a single ounce of sympathy or regret. I was simply observing a fascinating, tragic psychological experiment reaching its inevitable conclusion. For my entire life, I had believed that my family possessed a bond that I was simply excluded from. I had spent my childhood watching Calvin, Brenda, and Jasmine operate as a unified, impenetrable front. They took lavish family vacations to Europe and left me behind to watch the house. They posed for glossy, perfectly coordinated holiday cards, smiling brightly while I was forced to stand behind the camera. I had spent countless nights crying in my room, agonizing over what fundamental, unlovable flaw I possessed that made me so unworthy of their affection. But watching them now, listening to the vicious, unforgiving way they tore into each other's deepest insecurities, the truth became blindingly clear. There was no loyalty among them. There never had been. Their entire relationship was a hollow transactional arrangement, built purely on money status and the desperate need to maintain an illusion of superiority over the rest of the world. They only tolerated each other because it was financially beneficial. They only smiled for the cameras because it protected their social standing. The moment the wealth evaporated, the moment the illusion of prestige shattered the glue holding the Caldwell family together, dissolved instantly. Without their bank accounts, they were turning into starving wolves, tearing each other's throats out to avoid taking responsibility for their own spectacular failures. Brenda pushed herself up from the floor, her makeup smeared down her face, her tailored suit ruined. She stepped frantically between her husband and her golden child, raising her hands in a desperate attempt to regain control of her shattered kingdom. "Stop it!" Brenda cried, her voice ragged and breathless. "Both of you stop it right now. We are a family. We cannot turn on each other. We have to figure out a plan. The bank is coming. The social fallout will be catastrophic. We have to present a united front to the press tomorrow morning." Jasmine slowly turned her venomous glare onto her mother, her eyes burning with hatred. "A united front?" Jasmine asked, her voice dropping to a dangerous, mocking whisper. "You paid off your credit cards with money stolen from my husband's clients. You are just as guilty as he is. You are a parasite, Mom. You are a shallow parasite who feeds off anyone who can buy you a new designer bag." Brenda gasped, clutching her chest, as if she had been physically stabbed. "I gave you everything," she wailed, tears streaming down her face. "I molded you. I made you who you are. You made me a wife to a felon," Jasmine screamed back, her voice echoing into the rafters. The screaming match reached a fever pitch, the three of them circling each other in the center of the living room, completely consumed by their own selfish rage and terror. I watched the scene for another full minute, feeling a profound, absolute sense of closure wash over my soul. The ghosts of my childhood were finally exorcised. The power they held over me was completely broken. I turned slightly, looking up at Elijah. He offered me a soft, understanding nod. It was time to leave. We had witnessed enough. I took a step backward toward the threshold of the front door. The subtle movement caught Jasmine's eye. She stopped mid-sentence, cutting off a vicious insult aimed at her father. She looked around the ruined living room. She saw Calvin clutching the foreclosure notice, shaking with rage and impotence. She saw Brenda weeping hysterically, entirely incapable of solving a problem that could not be fixed with a credit card. She saw the absolute reality of her impending homelessness, her frozen bank accounts, and her ruined social standing staring her in the face. Then she looked directly at me. She looked at my pristine tailored suit. She looked at the towering, fiercely protective billionaire tech magnate standing by my side. She looked at the secure, undeniable wealth and absolute stability that I now possessed. The transformation was instantaneous and terrifying to witness. The feral, screaming rage completely vanished from Jasmine's face. The harsh, ugly lines of her jaw softened in the blink of an eye. Her shoulders slumped forward. She let out a small, pathetic whimper, forcing fresh tears to well up in her eyes. She physically shrank herself, abandoning the vicious predator and instantly adopting the role of a helpless, frightened victim who had been wronged by the world. She took a hesitant step toward the foyer, wiping a tear from her cheek with the back of her trembling hand. She ignored our screaming parents, entirely stepping over the broken crystal on the rug. Maya, Jasmine whispered suddenly, adopting a soft, innocent, sisterly tone that she had never once used with me in her entire 30 years of life. She took another step, reaching her hand out toward me, as if I were her only lifeline in a stormy sea. "Maya, please," she said, her voice wavering perfectly. "I have absolutely nothing left. The government took everything. I cannot stay here. The bank is taking the house." She sniffled, looking up at me through wet eyelashes, deploying the ultimate shameless manipulation tactic. "Maya, can I stay with you?" Just until I get on my feet. I looked down at my older sister. Jasmine knelt on the Persian rug, her hands clasped together, her mascara running down her cheeks in dark, jagged rivers. She looked incredibly small, entirely stripped of the haughty country club arrogance that had defined her entire existence. Just hours earlier, she had stood in the kitchen, wearing this exact same silk designer gown, laughing with our mother while I scrubbed burned grease out of a roasting pan. She had mocked my clothes, sneered at my career, and proudly flaunted the stolen wealth her husband had showered upon her. Now she was begging for scraps. She genuinely expected me to open my doors to her. She believed, despite a lifetime of relentless cruelty, that the invisible toxic strings of familial obligation would bind me to her. She thought I would simply absorb her burden because I was the reliable, invisible scapegoat who always cleaned up the messes she left behind. "No, Jasmine," I said, my voice completely void of anger, resentment, or spite. "You cannot." The absolute flatness of my tone made the rejection infinitely more devastating. If I had yelled, if I had screamed and thrown her past insults in her face, she could have dismissed me as bitter or jealous. But the cold, unfeeling finality of my refusal shattered her. Jasmine flinched as if I had struck her across the face. Her mouth fell open, her breath hitching in her throat. "But I have nowhere to go." Jasmine stammered, her voice pitching into a panicked whine. "My accounts are frozen. The feds are going to seize my cars. I do not have a credit card that works. You have massive guest rooms in your house, Maya. I know you do. You would not even notice I was there. I just need a place to stay while the lawyers sort this out." "There is nothing to sort out," I stated smoothly, crossing my arms over my chest. "Your husband embezzled millions of dollars. The money is gone. The lifestyle is over. Moving into my guest room is not going to magically restore your status at the country club. You are 32 years old, Jasmine. It is time to get a real job." The phrase hit the room like a physical shockwave. A real job. Those words were absolute blasphemy to a woman who had spent her entire adult life treating employment as something meant only for the lower classes. "I cannot get a job," Jasmine shrieked, her voice echoing shrilly in the empty foyer. "I do not know how to do anything. I have not worked since I was 22. I have a degree in art history that I have never used. Who is going to hire me? How am I supposed to pay for anything?" "That sounds like a spectacular opportunity for personal growth," I replied, my expression unmoving. "You can start by updating your resume. I hear the retail sector is always hiring." Jasmine let out a loud, agonizing wail, burying her face in her hands once again. "Maya, how can you be so heartless?" Brenda cried out, stepping forward to shield her weeping golden child. "She is your sister. She is bleeding, she is terrified, and she needs her family. You have millions of dollars sitting in the bank. You own a massive company. You can afford to put her up in a luxury condo. You can afford to give her an allowance until Preston gets out. You are acting like a cruel, vindictive monster." I did not even bother looking at Brenda. My mother's desperate attempts at manipulation had completely lost their power. Her words were just meaningless noise, empty threats from a woman who no longer held any authority over my emotional state. The utter silence with which I met Brenda's outburst ignited a different kind of fury in the room. From the bottom of the grand staircase, Calvin pulled himself up. His face was blotchy, his breathing heavy and labored. He still gripped the bank's foreclosure notice in his thick fist, the bright yellow paper crumpling under his white-knuckled grip. He had just watched his wife beg. He had just watched his favorite daughter sob on the floor. And he had just watched me, the daughter he had dismissed as a colossal failure, systematically deny them the salvation they demanded. His patriarchal pride, the toxic, domineering ego that had ruled the Caldwell family for 3 decades, flared up for one final desperate stand. He could not accept that he was bankrupt. He could not accept that he had been outsmarted by his criminal son-in-law. Most of all, he could not accept that he was entirely at my mercy. He stomped toward the center of the living room, his chest puffed out, attempting to project the terrifying, booming authority he used to wield over me when I was a frightened teenager. "You will not disrespect your sister and your mother in this way," Calvin roared, his voice shaking the crystal pieces of the chandelier overhead. He pointed his thick finger directly at my face, closing the distance between us with aggressive, heavy steps. He wanted to intimidate me. He wanted me to shrink back, to lower my eyes, to instantly submit to his demands, just as my mother and sister always did. "You listen to me right now, Maya!" Calvin bellowed, a spray of saliva flying from his lips. "I am your father, and I demand you help us. You are going to write a check to clear the bridge loan on my corporate accounts. You are going to secure a high-end apartment for Jasmine. You are going to show this family the respect and the financial support we are entitled to. You owe me. I put a roof over your head. I paid for your education. You will do exactly as I say." The sheer blind aggression in his posture instantly triggered the protective instincts of the man standing beside me. Elijah moved. He did not hesitate. The billionaire tech magnate shifted his massive muscular frame directly in front of me, placing himself squarely between Calvin and my body. Elijah's face hardened into a mask of pure lethal intimidation. His dark eyes locked onto my father with a terrifying intensity that instantly halted Calvin in his tracks. Elijah did not raise his fists, but the subtle, dangerous shift in his posture radiated a clear, undeniable warning. One more step, and Calvin would be physically destroyed. Calvin froze his chest, heaving his eyes, darting nervously up to Elijah's imposing figure. The false bravado instantly evaporated under the crushing weight of Elijah's silent threat. I looked at Elijah's broad back, feeling a profound surge of warmth and love for the man who was so fiercely willing to protect me. But this was not his fight. This was the final chain I needed to break myself. I reached out and placed my hand gently on Elijah's bicep. The solid muscle beneath his tailored suit jacket was tense, coiled tight like a spring ready to release. "I have got this," I murmured softly, my voice calm and reassuring. Elijah glanced back at me over his shoulder. He searched my eyes for a fraction of a second, reading the absolute certainty and quiet strength radiating from my expression. The lethal tension in his shoulders slowly relaxed. He offered a short, respectful nod and took a single step back, giving me the floor, but remaining close enough to strike if Calvin dared to move again. I stepped completely out from behind Elijah's shadow. I stood tall, my spine perfectly straight, meeting my father's terrified, desperate gaze head-on. There was no fear left in my body. There was no lingering desire to please him, no desperate hope that he would finally acknowledge my worth. He was just a bankrupt, broken man, throwing a tantrum because he had lost his personal bank account. "I owe you absolutely nothing," I stated, my voice echoing clearly off the marble floors. "Putting a roof over my head when I was a child was your legal obligation. It was not a loan I am required to pay back with interest." Calvin opened his mouth, his face turning purple, but I cut him off instantly. "You spent my entire adult life tearing down every single accomplishment I ever earned." I continued, taking a slow, deliberate step toward him. "You mocked my software company when it was just a startup. You told your friends I was a glorified secretary. You laughed when I worked 18-hour days, calling it a desperate attempt to compensate for my lack of social grace. You placed Jasmine on a pedestal because she married a man with a flashy car and an offshore bank account, completely ignoring the fact that his money was fake and his morals were non-existent." Calvin swallowed hard, his eyes dropping to the floor. The blustering patriarch was entirely gone, replaced by a coward who could not even look his own daughter in the eye. "You demanded perfection, but you only ever respected the illusion of it," I said, driving the final nail into the coffin of his ego. "You lost the right to demand anything from me the day you told me I was a failure for not marrying a rich man." I paused, letting the heavy, suffocating silence stretch over the ruined living room. I looked at Brenda, who was sobbing silently into her hands. I looked at Jasmine, who was curled into a pathetic ball on the sofa. And finally, I looked back at Calvin, who was trembling, clutching his foreclosure notice like a shield that could no longer protect him. "Well, I didn't marry wealth, Dad," I said, my voice dropping to a low, lethal whisper that carried absolute finality. "I became it, and you are officially cut off." I watched the words hit him. The physical reaction was immediate. Calvin's large shoulders slumped, his chest caving inward as the last shred of his fabricated authority was entirely annihilated. He opened his mouth to speak, perhaps to issue one final desperate threat, or maybe to beg for mercy, but the absolute freezing conviction in my eyes stopped him dead. He had no power here. The empire he thought he ruled had never actually belonged to him at all, and the daughter he had treated like a peasant had just purchased the entire kingdom. I turned my back on the man who had tormented me for 3 decades. I did not storm away in anger. I did not rush. I walked slowly, deliberately, my heels clicking a steady rhythmic beat against the polished marble floor. Elijah fell perfectly into step beside me, his presence a towering wall of silent, unwavering support. The heavy mahogany front doors stood open, framing the cool, dark Atlanta night. The flashing lights were gone. The screaming had finally stopped. Behind me, the Caldwell family remained trapped in the wreckage of their own, making a trio of strangers bound together only by their shared, irreversible ruin. They would have to face the banks, the courts, and the vicious judgment of their social circle entirely on their own. I stepped over the threshold, walking out of their house and completely out of their lives. I breathed in the crisp air, feeling the undeniable absolute weightlessness of total freedom. The past was dead, the debt was canceled, and the future was entirely mine. The silence in the room was absolute. It was a thick, suffocating quiet that pressed heavily against the eardrums, completely filling the cavernous space of the rented mansion. The air was entirely devoid of the mocking laughter, the clinking crystal, and the arrogant boasts that had defined the evening just an hour ago. The silence was broken only by the ragged, uneven sound of Calvin desperately trying to pull oxygen into his lungs. The grand patriarch of the Caldwell family looked entirely hollowed out, a man who had just watched his entire universe collapse into dust. Jasmine remained completely mute on the velvet sofa, her mouth hanging open, as the brutal reality of her new impoverished existence paralyzed her vocal cords. I did not wait for a rebuttal. I did not wait for an apology. I simply reached down to the glass coffee table and picked up my leather purse. The soft scrape of the leather against the glass sounded like a gunshot in the silent room. I looped the strap over my shoulder and turned my back on the weeping, broken family. I did not look back. Elijah remained perfectly at my side, his hand returning to the small of my back, guiding me with a firm, protective warmth. We walked toward the heavy mahogany front doors. Our footsteps fell in perfect rhythmic synchronization against the imported marble flooring. With every single step I took, I felt a heavy, rusted chain snapping off my soul. I was leaving behind 30 years of emotional starvation. I was leaving behind the endless, exhausting cycle of trying to prove my worth to people who were biologically incapable of seeing it. The grand foyer, which had felt so intimidating and majestic when I arrived hours ago to scrub their pans, now just looked like an empty, echoing tomb. It was a monument to their fake, fraudulent lives, and I was walking out of it forever. We crossed the threshold, stepping out into the cool, humid Georgia night. The crisp air filled my lungs entirely, washing away the toxic, suffocating atmosphere of the Caldwell house. Behind us, the spell finally broke. Brenda snapped out of her shock. She realized what was happening. She realized that her ultimate lifeline, the billionaire daughter she had just spent the entire evening mocking and degrading, was actually walking away. The bank accounts were closed. The rescue was denied. The safety net was gone. Maya, wait. Brenda shrieked, the sound tearing through the quiet, affluent neighborhood like an emergency siren. I heard the frantic, uncoordinated clatter of her heels slipping on the marble floor inside. Maya, you cannot leave us like this! Brenda screamed, her voice pitching into absolute hysteria. Please, come back here right now! I kept walking down the wide stone steps, my head held high, my posture completely relaxed. I did not break my stride. Brenda burst through the front doors. In her blind, desperate panic, her expensive designer stiletto caught hard on the edge of the metal threshold. She stumbled violently, letting out a sharp cry as she pitched forward, catching herself hard against one of the massive stone columns to avoid face-planting onto the concrete. She did not stop to regain her composure. She kicked the ruined designer shoes off her feet entirely, abandoning the very symbols of the wealth she worshipped, and sprinted down the stone steps in her bare feet. She chased us down the long, sweeping driveway. The sharp gravel bit into her bare skin, but she did not stop. Her survival instinct completely overrode her physical pain and her lifelong obsession with public dignity. Maya. Please, Brenda, sobbed her voice cracking with pure, unadulterated desperation. You have to listen to me. As we reached the base of the driveway, the absolute stark reality of my new life was waiting for us. Parked directly under the bright glow of the streetlights was Elijah's vehicle. It was not the modest, unassuming sedan I had driven to family functions for years, the car they had endlessly sneered at and used as proof of my supposed failure. It was a custom, fully armored Mercedes Maybach, gleaming like a sleek black predator in the night. The vehicle radiated an untouchable astronomical level of wealth that made the rented mansion behind us look like a cheap stage play. It was the physical manifestation of true, quiet, legitimate power. There were no flashy logos, no loud colors, just the undeniable gravity of absolute financial supremacy. A uniformed chauffeur immediately stepped forward from the shadows, his posture rigid and highly professional. He opened the heavy reinforced rear door for me, bowing his head slightly in a silent display of absolute respect. He treated me not as the Caldwell family scapegoat, but as the queen of a newly forged empire. I slid into the luxurious, cream-colored leather interior. The cabin was a silent, perfectly climate-controlled sanctuary smelling of rich leather and expensive cologne. Elijah moved to walk around the back of the vehicle to enter the other side. But before the chauffeur could close my door, Brenda slammed into the side of the Maybach. She grabbed the edge of the open car door with both hands, her knuckles turning bone white as she clung to the heavy metal frame. She refused to let the chauffeur close it. The security driver immediately tensed, reaching out to physically remove her, but I raised a single finger. The chauffeur stopped, instantly stepping back but remaining perfectly poised to intervene. Brenda's physical appearance was completely horrifying. The woman who had spent 5 hours in a luxury salon chair that morning was entirely gone. Her hair was a tangled, sweaty mess plastered to her forehead. Her expensive waterproof makeup had completely surrendered, running down her cheeks in thick, dark, jagged tracks. Her tailored cream suit was stained, wrinkled, and pulled out of alignment. She looked completely broken, reduced to a desperate beggar clinging to the side of a billionaire's car. Maya, please. Brenda gasped, her chest heaving as she struggled to pull air into her lungs. She stared at me with wide, terrified eyes. She looked frantically at the plush interior of the car, taking in the ambient lighting, the crystal champagne flutes in the console, and the sheer magnitude of the wealth she was currently locked out of. She could see exactly what she had thrown away. "We are your family!" Brenda pleaded, her voice trembling violently. She tightened her grip on the car door, her fingernails scraping against the leather. "We are your blood, Maya. You cannot just abandon us to the wolves. You cannot leave your mother with nothing." We did not know what Preston was doing. I swear to you, we were entirely in the dark. We were victims of his manipulation too. We have nothing left. Calvin is ruined. Jasmine has nowhere to go. She sank to her knees on the harsh gravel, still gripping the door, looking up at me from the ground. She was deploying the ultimate final weapon in a narcissistic mother's arsenal. She was weaponizing her own tears. "Please, Maya." Brenda sobbed, the tears flowing freely down her ruined face. "We are so sorry. We are so sorry for everything. We love you. We have always loved you. Please just help us." I sat perfectly still in the plush leather seat. I looked down at the woman kneeling in the dirt. I did not feel a single flicker of sympathy. I did not feel a rush of familial guilt. I did not feel the desperate childhood urge to comfort her and make everything okay. I looked into her eyes past the tears and the theatrical sobbing, and I saw exactly what was actually there. I saw the pure, unfiltered greed. I saw the frantic calculation of a woman who was only apologizing because the bank accounts were empty. She did not love me. She did not regret a single insult she had ever hurled at me. She simply regretted that she had insulted the wrong bank account. My voice was calm, steady, and completely devoid of any emotion. "No, Mom," I said quietly, looking directly into her frantic eyes. "You love the Maybach." Brenda's mouth fell open, a silent gasp escaping her lips, as the absolute finality of my words struck her. "Goodbye." I reached out and pulled the heavy door inward. The chauffeur instantly stepped forward, taking the handle and firmly prying Brenda's fingers off the metal frame. He pushed her back gently, but with undeniable force, ensuring she was clear of the vehicle. The heavy armored door slammed shut with a solid echoing thud, instantly cutting off the sound of Brenda's wailing. I pressed the button on the armrest. The dark-tinted window rolled up smoothly, completely sealing the cabin and plunging me into a world of absolute, untouchable peace. I settled back into the soft leather just as Elijah slid into the seat beside me, the opposite door closing behind him. The Maybach pulled smoothly out of the driveway, leaving Brenda Caldwell kneeling in the gravel, screaming silently into the dark, entirely alone. 3 months passed. 90 days had evaporated since the heavy mahogany doors of that rented mansion slammed shut behind me, sealing the Caldwell family inside the tomb of their own making. The dust had finally settled, and the federal legal system had worked its course with a swift mechanical efficiency that left absolutely no room for negotiation or country club charm. The immediate fallout was a public spectacle of epic proportions. Preston was denied bail, deemed a flight risk due to the offshore accounts my encrypted dossier had so helpfully illuminated for the authorities. His trial was a bloodbath. The prosecution laid out a staggering trail of wire fraud, embezzlement, and systemic corporate theft. Preston stood in the courtroom, stripped of his tailored Italian suits and his arrogant smirk, wearing a standard-issue orange jumpsuit. The judge did not offer an ounce of leniency to a man who had defrauded elderly investors to fund a penthouse's lifestyle for his mistress and luxury cars for his demanding wife. Preston was sentenced to 8 years in federal prison. There would be no early parole, no country club minimum security facility, and absolutely no coming back to the financial sector. His white-collar life was permanently over. Jasmine experienced a fall from grace so steep and violent that it practically broke her in half. The federal government seized all of Preston's assets, freezing the bank accounts, repossessing the custom vehicles, and foreclosing on the luxury properties. Jasmine was left completely broke and entirely alone. The friends she had bought with expensive lunches and country club gossip vanished overnight, treating her like a walking contagion. Desperate to keep a roof over her head, the former golden child was forced to do the unthinkable. She carried her pristine collection of Hermes Birkins and classic Chanel flap bags into a high-end consignment shop in Buckhead, weeping as the clerk handed her a fraction of what Preston had paid for them with stolen money. The cash from the bags was barely enough to secure a tiny, cramped studio apartment in a neighborhood she would have previously refused to even drive through. But the ultimate indignity was her new reality. Jasmine, a woman who had never worked a day in her adult life, was forced to accept a position as a front desk receptionist at a mid-tier commercial hotel near the airport. She now spent 8 hours a day standing on her feet, wearing a cheap, scratchy polyester uniform, checking in tired business travelers and angry tourists. She had to swallow her immense pride, force a polite smile, and apologize to guests who yelled at her over missing towels and slow room service. The woman who used to snap her fingers at waitstaff was now fetching extra keycards for a minimum wage paycheck. Calvin and Brenda did not fare any better. The bank representatives had not been bluffing. The eviction from their foreclosed suburban mansion was swift and merciless. They were forced to pack whatever meager belongings the bank allowed them to keep into cardboard boxes, while their neighbors watched from behind drawn curtains. The 40 elite guests who had witnessed their spectacular downfall at the mansion spread the story like wildfire. The viral gossip decimated their reputations in under 24 hours. Calvin and Brenda were formally expelled from the country club. Their church community, a congregation built entirely on appearances and wealth, quietly requested they stop attending services to avoid causing a distraction. They were shunned by every social circle they had spent 30 years cultivating. With zero savings, mountains of debt, and a permanently ruined professional reputation, Calvin and Brenda were forced to move into a dark, cramped, 2-bedroom apartment on the industrial outskirts of the city. The air smelled perpetually of exhaust fumes and cheap carpet. Calvin, the man who had demanded total submission as the patriarch of a logistics empire, had to accept a job managing a small, dusty regional warehouse. He was working for a fraction of his former salary, reporting to a regional manager who was 20 years younger than him. My father spent his days wearing steel-toed boots, logging inventory, and occasionally helping load pallets when they were short-staffed. Brenda became a ghost. The woman who used to coordinate her outfits for trips to the organic market now shopped at discount grocery stores late at night, wearing large sunglasses and a pulled-up collar to hide her face. She lived in constant, agonizing terror that someone from her old life would see her clipping coupons in the canned goods aisle. Her entire identity had been tied to her social standing, and without it she was just an empty, bitter shell of a woman sitting in a dark apartment. I sat at my expansive glass desk in my corner office overlooking the city, reviewing the final numbers for a software deployment when my assistant walked in and placed the morning mail in my inbox. Right on top of the neat stack of corporate correspondence was a thick, pale blue envelope. I recognized the sweeping, overly dramatic cursive handwriting instantly. It was Brenda. I picked up the envelope, feeling the heavy, expensive cardstock she must have hoarded from her previous life. I did not open it. I did not need to read the words to know exactly what the pages contained. It would be a lengthy, pleading letter dripping with manufactured tears and heavy with emotional manipulation. It would be full of desperate excuses, blaming Preston, blaming Calvin, blaming the economy, blaming everyone but herself. It would inevitably pivot into demands for a reconciliation meeting, a thinly veiled attempt to secure a financial lifeline under the guise of family healing. She would talk about a mother's love. She would talk about forgiveness. I held the envelope between my fingers for a long moment. I felt absolutely nothing. No anger, no sadness, no lingering childhood guilt. I turned in my leather executive chair, reaching over to the heavy-duty industrial shredder sitting next to my filing cabinet. I pressed the power button, the machine humming to life with a low, mechanical growl. I dropped the pale blue envelope directly into the feeding slot. The steel blades caught the thick paper, pulling it down and chewing it into 100 unrecognizable ribbons in a matter of seconds. I turned back to my computer screen, dismissing Brenda Caldwell from my mind entirely. 6 months post-party, the oppressive, humid air of Atlanta was thousands of miles behind me. I sat on the sprawling, sun-drenched balcony of a magnificent beachfront estate in Malibu. The Pacific Ocean stretched out infinitely before me, a vast, glittering expanse of deep blue that crashed rhythmically against the pristine white sand below. The coastal breeze carried the sharp, clean scent of salt water tangling in my hair as I leaned back against the plush outdoor cushions. This was my new reality. The estate belonged to Elijah, and soon it would belong to us both. But I was not sitting on this balcony as a dependent. I was sitting here as an equal. Just 2 hours earlier, my legal team had finalized a massive corporate merger. My software firm had been acquired and integrated by a global tech conglomerate in a deal that had dominated the financial news cycle all morning. The ink was dry. The transfer was complete. My personal net worth had just multiplied exponentially, cementing my status, not just as a successful entrepreneur, but as a titan in the industry. I was no longer simply surviving the trauma of my past. I was thriving completely and utterly free of the toxic, suffocating weight of my family's expectations. The wealth I possessed was clean-earned through relentless innovation and sleepless nights unburdened by fraud or deceit. The heavy glass balcony door slid open, and Elijah stepped out into the California sunlight. He was dressed casually in dark linen pants and a crisp white shirt with the sleeves rolled up, looking incredibly relaxed. He carried 2 tall crystal flutes filled with vintage champagne. His dark eyes caught the sunlight as he walked toward me, his expression radiating a deep, unwavering pride. He handed me a glass, the cool crystal a stark contrast to the warmth of the afternoon sun. He took a seat beside me, reaching out to rest his hand over mine. To the newest major player in the global tech sector, Elijah murmured, his voice a rich, comforting rumble. "You built an empire from the ground up, Maya. You earned every single piece of this victory." I smiled, tapping my glass against his with a soft melodic clink. To us, I replied. Elijah took a slow sip of his champagne, his gaze shifting out toward the crashing waves. My wedding planner sent over the finalized seating charts this morning. He noted a teasing smile playing on his lips. We are officially locked in. Our upcoming wedding was going to be exactly what we wanted. It was an intimate, beautiful affair set to take place right here on the estate grounds. There would be no sprawling guest list of society snobs to impress. There would be no fake relatives performing for cameras. The guest list was strictly limited to our chosen family, our real friends, the loyal colleagues who had stood by us in the trenches, and the mentors who had shaped our careers. It was a celebration of authentic love, devoid of the toxic social climbing that had poisoned my entire childhood. I took a sip of the dry, perfectly chilled champagne and looked out at the endless horizon. The peace I felt in my chest was absolute. It was a profound, quiet stillness that I had never experienced when I was trying to survive under Calvin's roof. I thought about the journey that had led me to this balcony. I thought about the Thanksgiving dinners spent in the kitchen, the mocking laughter, the stolen money, and the desperate, pathetic demands for salvation. They had tried to bury me. They had actively attempted to push me into the dirt so they could use me as a stepping stone to lift up my sister. They wanted me small, silent, and compliant, but they did not realize they had planted a seed. The pressure, the isolation, and the cruelty had forced me to grow stronger roots, to push through the dark, and build a foundation made of steel. In the end, the truth had acted like sunlight, exposing everyone for exactly what they were. I smiled, leaning my head onto Elijah's shoulder. I watched a pair of seagulls dive toward the ocean's surface, completely unbothered by the world below. Sometimes I realized the best revenge isn't a fiery confrontation or a dedicated campaign of destruction. You do not have to lift a finger to ruin people who are fundamentally corrupt. The best revenge is simply watching the people who called you a failure destroy themselves with their own greed and incompetence. You let them dig their own graves while you sit back, secure the bag, and live your life in absolute untouchable peace. The story powerfully illustrates that true security and self-worth come from within, not from external validation or toxic family expectations. Maya's journey from being the family scapegoat to a self-made billionaire reveals that breaking free from manipulative environments is not an act of cruelty, but a necessary boundary for survival and personal growth. Blood relations do not guarantee loyalty, respect, or unconditional love. Those must be earned. By choosing her own path and refusing to be dragged down by her family's deceit, Maya demonstrates that the ultimate victory is securing your own peace and thriving independently. If you found Maya's journey of setting boundaries and claiming her independence inspiring, be sure to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and share your own experiences with overcoming toxic family dynamics in the comments below.